Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the sacred grounds where silence should reign eternal, yet the restless refuse to rest. In this episode we bring you 8 disturbing accounts of encounters within the hallowed corridors of our nation's cemeteries and graveyards. From the windswept headstones of Colorado to the moss-laden crypts of Louisiana, these testimonies emerge from individuals who dared to walk among the dead and discovered that some graves cannot contain what lies beneath. Each story has been reconstructed from detailed witness accounts, police reports, and first-hand testimonials of those who experienced the unexplainable in these places of eternal rest. The voices you will hear belong to groundskeepers who worked the midnight shift, visitors paying respects to loved ones, and investigators who stumbled upon phenomena that defied rational explanation. To preserve the dignity of the deceased and protect the privacy of the living witnesses, certain identifying details, including specific cemetery names and personal information, have been carefully altered. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that unearths the darkest corners of human experience. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we excavate another collection of buried truths that refuse to stay dead. The old man's hands were stained with decades of Colorado soil. Weathered fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as the autumn sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountain peaks. Calvin Brooks had been the caretaker of Hillcrest Cemetery for 37 years, and in all that time he had never spoken about what he witnessed on those crisp October nights when the veil between worlds grew thin. "You want to know about the lantern?" Calvin said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in silence. The shadows lengthened across the weathered headstones as he settled back in his wooden chair on the cemetery office porch. "Most folks around here, they heard the stories, but they never lived with it like I have." Calvin's weathered face turned toward the rows of granite markers that stretched into the gathering dusk. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the small mountain town of Silver Cliff, population barely 800 souls. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets had a way of festering in the thin mountain air until they became something else entirely. The kind of place where whispered conversations behind the post office carried more weight than headlines in the Denver papers. "Started back in 1987, Calvin continued, his breath visible in the cooling air. "October 15th to be exact. I remember because it was the night after old Martha Hendricks was laid to rest. She'd lived in this town for 93 years, never married, never had children, spent her whole life taking care of other people's business, knowing every secret, every shame, every buried truth this town tried to forget. Martha Hendricks had been the town librarian for 62 years, a position that gave her access to more than just books and periodicals. People trusted librarians with their private conversations, their hushed phone calls, their desperate searches through old newspaper archives. Martha had witnessed decades of cover-ups, lies told to protect reputations, and documents that mysteriously disappeared when they threatened powerful families. She kept meticulous records in her personal journal, documenting every suspicious transaction, every unexplained death, every family that suddenly left town. The first time Calvin saw the light, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had been making his evening rounds, checking that the day's burial service had been properly cleaned up. The funeral director from Pueblo always left behind small messes that Calvin took pride in correcting. Scattered rose petals, folding chairs not properly stacked, programs blowing against headstones in the mountain wind. As he walked between the headstones, collecting forgotten flowers and straightening American flags, he noticed a soft glow emanating from somewhere near the back section of the cemetery. Figured it was some kids with flashlights, Calvin explained, taking a slow sip of his coffee. We get them. Sometimes teenagers thinking they're brave enough to spend a night among the dead. Usually they scatter like rabbits when they hear my boots crunching through the gravel. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't no flashlight. This light, it moved different. Had a quality to it that made the hair on my arms stand up, made my teeth ache like before a thunderstorm. The light appeared to be coming from an old-fashioned lantern, the kind with a glass chimney and metal frame that miners used to carry deep into the Colorado mountains. The brass fittings had developed a greenish patina, and the glass was clouded with age, yet the flame inside burned with intensity that seemed to come from another world entirely. It hovered about 3 feet off the ground, swaying gently as if carried by invisible hands. The warm yellow glow cast long shadows between the headstones, creating shapes that seemed to writhe and dance in Calvin's peripheral vision. Calvin approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. In all his years tending to the dead, he had never felt the kind of primal fear that gripped him in that moment. The temperature seemed to drop with each step he took toward the mysterious light, and the familiar sounds of the mountain evening, the rustle of aspen leaves, the distant call of an owl faded into unnatural silence. The lantern moved with purpose, following what appeared to be the old walking paths that connected different sections of the cemetery. Paths that had been established when the graveyard was first consecrated in 1892. Paths that most people had forgotten existed beneath decades of fallen leaves. The strangest part, Calvin said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, was that the light seemed to know where it was going. It would pause at certain graves, hover there for maybe 30 seconds, then move on to the next one. Always the same pattern, always the same graves, like it was reading something written on the headstones that I couldn't see. Over the following weeks, Calvin began to document which graves the lantern visited. He kept a small notebook in his jacket pocket, jotting down dates and times and locations. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Every grave the lantern lingered over belonged to someone who had died with unfinished business in Silver Cliff. Martha Hendricks was just the beginning of a pattern that stretched back generations. There was Thomas Kellerman, who had died in a car accident in 1973. 3 days before he was supposed to testify in a corruption case involving the town's former mayor. His vehicle had skidded off Highway 24 in perfect weather conditions, crashing into a stand of aspen trees with suspicious force. Rebecca Walsh, who passed away from a heart attack in 1981 while investigating financial irregularities at the local bank. She had been 38 years old with no prior heart problems, found clutching a manila folder filled with evidence that disappeared before the coroner arrived. James Moreau, who died of pneumonia in 1958 after spending months trying to prove that his business partner had been embezzling funds from their mining operation. Each one of them died before they could expose the truth about something, Calvin said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. Each one of them took secrets to their graves that could have changed this town forever. Could have saved other people from being cheated, lied to, maybe even killed. The lantern appeared every night for 3 weeks straight. Calvin found himself drawn to watch its nightly journey, following at a respectful distance as it moved between the headstones. The October air grew colder each evening, frost beginning to form on the marble angels and granite crosses. He began to notice that the light grew brighter on certain nights, particularly when the wind carried voices from town up the hill to the cemetery. Voices arguing behind closed doors, voices making deals in dark alleyways, voices covering up truths that needed to be spoken. On those nights, the lantern would pulse with urgent rhythm, as if responding to the corruption that continued to poison the town below. On November 7th, exactly 23 days after Martha Hendricks was buried, the lantern's behavior changed. Instead of following its usual route through the cemetery, it moved directly to Calvin's office. It hovered outside his window, casting that warm yellow glow across his desk, where he kept his documentation of the nightly visits. The light pulsed gently, as if trying to get his attention, as if it had something urgent to communicate. Calvin opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The lantern hung in the air just beyond his reach, swaying gently in the mountain breeze. For the first time since the appearances began, Calvin felt no fear. Instead, he felt profound sadness, as if the light itself was mourning for all the truths that would never be told, all the justice that would never be served, all the innocent people who had suffered because good people had died too soon. "I understood then," Calvin said, his voice thick with emotion. "The lantern wasn't trying to scare anybody. It was trying to remind us. Remind us that some debts don't get settled just because someone dies. Some promises don't get broken just because the person who made them is 6 feet under." The next morning, Calvin walked into the Silver Cliff Police Department and handed over his notebook. Every entry, every observation, every pattern he had documented during those 3 weeks of nightly visits. He told Chief Morrison about Martha Hendricks' investigation into the town's missing municipal funds, about the ledger she had hidden in the library basement. He explained how Thomas Kellerman had discovered evidence of vote manipulation in the 1972 mayoral election. He detailed Rebecca Walsh's findings about the systematic overcharging of elderly customers at Morrison's family-owned bank. Chief Morrison listened to every word, Calvin continued, didn't interrupt once. When I finished talking, he closed my notebook and told me he'd look into it. 2 days later, he arrested his own uncle for embezzlement. 3 days after that, they found the missing municipal funds in an account belonging to the former mayor's widow. The arrests didn't stop there. Within a month, half the town council had been indicted for corruption. Property that had been illegally seized was returned to rightful owners. Families who had been cheated out of insurance settlements finally received justice. The truth had a way of spreading once it was allowed to breathe. The lantern appeared one final time on November 15th, exactly 1 month after Martha Hendricks was buried. Calvin watched from his office window as it made its usual rounds, pausing at each grave where it had lingered before. But this time was different. At each stop, the light seemed to pulse 3 times, like a signal or farewell. When it reached Martha's grave, it hovered there for nearly 10 minutes before slowly fading away, leaving behind the faintest scent of kerosene and mountain wildflowers. Calvin finished his coffee as full darkness settled over the cemetery. The mountain air carried the scent of approaching snow, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its lonesome song to the stars. The familiar sounds of the Colorado evening had returned. The whisper of wind through pine branches, the distant rumble of a freight train crossing the valley. "Never saw the light again after that night," he said, standing slowly from his chair. "But I learned something important. Sometimes the dead don't rest because the living won't listen. Sometimes the only way to find peace is to finish what was started, even if it takes 37 years and a mysterious lantern to show you the way." Calvin gathered his empty coffee cup and turned toward his small cottage at the edge of the cemetery grounds. "The dead have their own sense of justice," he called back over his shoulder. "And in Silver Cliff, justice has a way of finding the light." As Calvin disappeared into the gathering darkness, a soft breeze rustled through the pine trees that bordered the cemetery. For just a moment, just long enough to make a person wonder, a faint yellow glow seemed to flicker between the headstones before vanishing into the Colorado night. Some say that on clear autumn evenings when corruption threatens to take root in Silver Cliff again, the lantern still appears to those who know how to look. "Drive faster, Lily. She's still there," Marcus shouted from the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the dashboard. The speedometer needle climbed past 70 as Lily Ramirez pressed harder on the accelerator, her Honda Civic racing down Archer Avenue through the dark Illinois countryside. "I'm trying," Lily's voice cracked as she checked the rearview mirror. Behind them, the iron gates of Resurrection Cemetery grew smaller, but the image of what they had witnessed burned bright in both their minds. The pale figure in the white dress standing motionless in their headlights before vanishing like morning mist. It had started as a dare 3 hours earlier. Lily's co-workers at the Chicago Tribune had been sharing ghost stories during their late shift, and someone mentioned the legend of Resurrection Mary, the phantom hitchhiker who supposedly haunted the stretch of road between the Willowbrook Ballroom and Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois. Marcus, who worked in sports and had been trying to ask Lily out for months, volunteered to drive with her to investigate. "It's probably just local folklore," Lily had said, gathering her notebook and camera. At 26, she had built a reputation as a skeptical journalist who specialized in debunking urban legends. But it might make for an interesting Halloween feature. Now, as they put distance between themselves and the cemetery, Lily was questioning everything she thought she knew about the supernatural. Her hands trembled as she finally slowed the car, pulling into a 24-hour diner in nearby Burbank. "Tell me what you saw," Lily said once they were seated in a corner booth, both nursing cups of black coffee. The fluorescent lights felt reassuring after the darkness of Archer Avenue, but neither could shake what had happened. Marcus ran his hands through his dark hair. "Same thing you saw. We were driving past the cemetery around midnight, and there she was, standing right in the middle of the road wearing that white ball gown. You hit the brakes so hard I thought we were going to slide into her." Lily nodded, replaying the scene. She had been driving the speed limit when the figure appeared in their headlights. A young woman with pale skin and dark hair wearing an elaborate white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. She had been standing perfectly still, not moving to get out of the way, showing no fear at the approaching vehicle. "But when I got out to check on her," Lily continued, "she was gone. Completely gone. And the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. That was the part that disturbed Lily most. As a journalist, she was trained to observe details, to look for logical explanations. But there had been nowhere for the woman to hide. The road was straight with open fields on both sides. No trees, no buildings, no ditches deep enough to conceal a person. The woman had simply vanished. My grandmother used to tell stories about Resurrection Mary," Marcus said quietly. "She grew up in this neighborhood back in the 40s. Said her older sister claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker on Archer Avenue one night. Beautiful girl in a white dress who asked to be taken to the cemetery. When they got there, the girl just disappeared from the back seat. Over the next week, Lily threw herself into researching the legend. She spent hours in the Chicago Public Library archives looking through old newspaper clippings and police reports. What she found surprised her. The stories went back decades with dozens of documented encounters involving a female hitchhiker who matched the same description. The earliest report she could find was from 1939, when a taxi driver claimed to have picked up a young woman outside the Willowbrook Ballroom. The woman, dressed in a white ball gown, asked to be taken to Resurrection Cemetery. When they arrived, she vanished from the back seat without paying the fare. The driver insisted he had locked the doors and never heard them open. Similar stories appeared in police reports throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Always the same pattern. A young woman in white, picked up along Archer Avenue asking to go to the cemetery, then vanishing without explanation. Some witnesses described her as warm to the touch and completely solid. Others said she felt cold and seemed to glow faintly. Lily interviewed retired Chicago police officers who had worked the area during the height of the sightings. Detective Raymond Kowalski, now 78, remembered taking multiple reports about the mysterious hitchhiker during his career. "We always took the calls seriously," Kowalski told her during an interview at his South Side home. Most of the witnesses were solid citizens. Business people, nurses getting off late shifts, couples driving home from dates, not the type to make up stories. The detective showed Lily a file he had kept from his active duty days, filled with witness statements and incident reports. One case from 1976 particularly caught her attention. A young man named David Martinez had reported picking up a female hitchhiker on Archer Avenue around 11:30 at night. She was standing by the side of the road near the cemetery entrance, Martinez had told police. Beautiful girl, maybe 20 years old, wearing a white formal dress. She seemed upset, like she'd been crying. When I asked where she needed to go, she just said home and pointed toward the cemetery. Martinez described driving the woman to the cemetery gates, where she asked him to stop. When he turned to ask if she needed help getting inside, she was gone. The passenger door was still closed and locked, but the seat was empty. Martinez had immediately driven to the nearest police station to report the incident. The strange thing, Detective Kowalski explained, was that Martinez mentioned the girl felt cold when she got in the car. Not just cool skin, but actually cold, like she'd been standing outside in winter weather. But it was July, and the temperature that night was in the 80s. Lily found similar details in other witness accounts. The mysterious woman always felt unnaturally cold to the touch. She rarely spoke beyond asking to go to the cemetery or simply saying home, and she invariably disappeared when the vehicle reached the cemetery gates, leaving no trace except for the lingering scent of roses and vanilla. The most compelling evidence came from a 1983 incident that had been photographed by accident. A couple returning from their wedding reception had stopped to help what they thought was a stranded motorist near Resurrection Cemetery. The bride had taken several pictures to document their special day. When the film was developed, one photograph showed a figure in white standing near the cemetery gates, but the woman who had flagged them down was nowhere to be seen. The image was grainy and unclear, but it clearly showed someone in an old-fashioned white dress where no such person should have been visible. Lily spent an afternoon at the cemetery, walking the grounds and talking to groundskeepers. The cemetery, established in 1904, contained thousands of graves dating back over a century. She found several graves of young women who had died in the 30s and 40s, any one of whom could potentially match the description of Resurrection Mary. One grave in particular caught her attention. Anna Maria Norcus, who had died in 1927 at the age of 22. According to cemetery records, Anna had been killed in a car accident while returning home from a dance at the O'Henry Ballroom, which later became the Willowbrook Ballroom. She had been wearing a white beaded dress when she died and was buried in the same gown. "The timing fits," Lily told Marcus as they sat in her apartment, surrounded by research materials. The first reported sightings of Resurrection Mary began about 12 years after Anna's death. And the location matches perfectly. She died on Archer Avenue, not far from where people claim to see the hitchhiker. 2 weeks after their encounter, Lily decided to return to Archer Avenue. This time, she went alone, armed with a digital camera and voice recorder. She wanted to approach the investigation objectively without emotional influence. She parked near the cemetery entrance around 11:30, the same time most sightings were reported. The October night was clear and cold, with a full moon casting long shadows across the roadway. Lily sat in her car for nearly an hour, watching and waiting. At 12:15, she saw headlights approaching from the direction of the Willowbrook Ballroom. A pickup truck slowed as it passed the cemetery, then came to a complete stop about 50 yards ahead. The driver got out and walked to the passenger side of his vehicle, opening the door as if letting someone out. Lily started her engine and drove closer, pulling alongside the truck. The driver, a middle-aged man in work clothes, looked confused and frightened. "Did you see where she went?" he asked Lily through her open window. "Where who went?" "The girl I picked up back at the ballroom. Young lady in a white dress. She asked me to bring her here to the cemetery, but when I stopped to let her out, she was gone. Doors still locked, but the seats empty." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. She had just witnessed the Resurrection Mary phenomenon from a different perspective, seeing another driver experience exactly what she and Marcus had encountered 2 weeks earlier. "This has happened before," Lily told the man, introducing herself as a journalist. "You're not crazy, and you're not the first person to experience this." The man, who identified himself as Robert Chen, a construction worker from nearby Oak Lawn, seemed relieved to hear that others had similar experiences. He described the hitchhiker exactly as Lily remembered her. Young, pale, wearing an elaborate white dress with dark hair styled in vintage waves. "She seemed so real," Chen said. "We talked during the drive. She told me her name was Mary and that she was trying to get home. Her hands were ice cold when I helped her into the truck, but I figured she'd been waiting outside for a while." Lily interviewed Chen for over an hour, documenting every detail of his encounter. His story matched the historical reports almost perfectly, adding another piece to the puzzle of Resurrection Mary. 3 months later, Lily published her article about Resurrection Mary in the Chicago Tribune Sunday edition. She presented the historical evidence, the witness testimonies, and her own experience with journalistic objectivity, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. The article generated hundreds of responses from readers who claimed to have had similar encounters along Archer Avenue. Some described picking up the mysterious hitchhiker, others reported seeing her walking alone near the cemetery. A few readers shared family stories that had been passed down for generations, adding to the rich folklore surrounding the phantom of Resurrection Cemetery. But for Lily, the most significant outcome was personal. The experience had challenged her skeptical worldview and opened her mind to possibilities she had never considered. She continued to investigate paranormal phenomena throughout her career, always approaching each case with the same rigorous methodology she had applied to the Resurrection Mary story. And sometimes, on clear October nights when the moon is full, Lily still drives down Archer Avenue past the cemetery gates. Not as a skeptical journalist looking to debunk a legend, but as someone who knows that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some stories are too powerful to be explained away, and some spirits refuse to rest until they find their way home. The letter arrived pressed beneath a bouquet of dried magnolia leaves, edges browned and curling from the Louisiana heat. It was addressed to Miss Clara Everett, Ashland, Oregon, in a slanted, looping hand that immediately brought a lump to her throat. Just the sight of the return address, Maplewood Cemetery Office, St. James Parish, Louisiana, made Clara clutch the envelope with trembling fingers. Miles Everett had been the caretaker of Maplewood for almost 12 years, ever since his father's death. That cemetery was old in the way only southern cemeteries could be, with wrought iron arches, mausoleums buckling under strangler vines, and statues with watching eyes. Miles was younger than most caretakers, 41, broad-shouldered, with a battered Red Sox cap he wore in every season, and a way of moving that suggested he had never forgotten to check over his shoulder. He wrote to his sister when the weight of his job pressed too hard on his chest. and some buried family secret threatened to burst forth like a yellow jacket's hive beneath the grass. Clara, reading his letter from 1,000 miles away, heard the tremor in her brother's words. It was more pronounced this time, and as she read, she kept brushing at an imagined tickle along her forearms, the kind that comes when the air gets heavy before a southern storm. Dear Clara, last night the statues started whispering again. It had been 2 years since the last time. You remember what I wrote then? The night after we put Father in the ground and I was sitting by the old Carter mausoleum thinking about what you said about moving north. I heard the bronze angel by the east gate murmur my name. Everett, she said, so soft I thought it was the wind in the Spanish moss. But pretty soon every angel, cherub, and draped lady in that half-acre started in, hissing words I could not understand, all at once until I had to press my hands to my ears. Clara, I thought I was losing my mind. I checked every inch of the cemetery by lantern light, found nothing but my own footprints in the dew. But last night, it was worse. It started at dusk. I was by the Grant plot, pruning the wild blackberries from around the iron rail. There was a breeze, just enough to rustle the leaves, and then I heard it. Whispers clear as day this time, like stone lips pressed against the air. It was not just one statue, but many, chiming in one after the other, names and dates, and then... He paused in the letter with a long blank space as if trying to protect her from what came next. Clara found herself holding her breath. One of them said your name. It was not my voice, and it was not anything human, but it said Clara, sure as sunrise. It called to me 3 times before it stopped. You must believe me, I am not making this up. I have kept myself alert, writing down times and locations, documenting the events like an investigator. Even took the old tape recorder you sent me for my birthday and turned it on during my rounds. I will mail you the cassette if you want, but I can hardly bear to hear it myself. I know you are thinking of Father, how his mind went toward the end. But this is real. The groundskeeper's dog would not come within 100 yards after dark. I found the candles I set at the grave sites blown out, stands knocked over as if by a strong, directed wind, though the air was still all evening. The sheriff dropped by at sundown, asking after stories of stolen flowers. The neighbors down on Chapel Street had complained, said they kept hearing what sounded like a woman singing after midnight, coming from among the graves. I do not know what to do, Clara. Something is wrong in Maplewood. Your brother, Miles. Clara read those words over and over, searching for reason in the gaps. The image of her brother out at dusk with only his lantern and the iron gates behind him brought back the worst of their childhood memories. Their father standing watch on their old porch, hammer in hand, muttering about shadows that move on their own, and their mother insisting on prayers for restless souls. She had always dismissed it as the superstition of old Louisiana, no more substantial than the stories traded at the corner store. She called Miles the next morning. The phone rang for a long time before his weary voice answered. He sounded older than she remembered, gravelly and slow, as if sleep had not come for days. I am telling you because no one else would believe it, he said before Clara could ask. It is not just noises or flickering shadows. The statues move, only when you are not looking directly. I catch them out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes they are looking at me when before they face the road. Sometimes a hand is extended that was never sculpted before, or a mouth open where there was none. I have pictures, I can send them, he did later that afternoon. The images arrived by email. Each photo showed some subtle, unexplainable shift. The mourning angel beside the Mayfield grave with a different set of rosaries in her folded hands. The marble cherub whose face bore fresh streaks as if from spent tears. She studied them late into the night, comparing them to the cemetery's archived photos. The differences were undeniable. Miles began to call Clara nightly. Every evening as dusk settled, so too did his dread. He could not bring himself to quit his job. The Everetts had been caretakers for generations. Instead, he documented everything. On the third night, he told her about the dream. I was standing in the center of the cemetery, looking at the rows of statues. It was twilight, the hour when the solar lights flicker on. All the statues, every one of them, turned to face me at once. They spoke not in English, but in voices like wind through iron gates and rain on stone. I woke up in a sweat, and when I went outside, every single statue was facing the main path. That has never happened before. I rotated a few of them back myself, but in the morning they were all turned forward again. Word got out among the locals that something was wrong at Maplewood. The sheriff's deputies began refusing to patrol the cemetery at night, and the groundskeeper quit after his dog refused to go near the east gate, howling at nothing and clawing madly at the chain-link fence. The florist who supplied bouquets for the old family's tombs found her arrangements wilting overnight, petals blackened as if burned by acid. Rumors spread, stories of children gone missing a century before, of deals made with voodoo priests and broken oaths by the first settlers. The priests at St. James would not come to bless the grounds, even when Miles offered double their usual fee. "The dead are uneasy," one old priest said, not meeting Miles's eyes. "Something is unfinished here." Even the city tried to avoid the place, blaming the strange happenings on sulfur vents under the marsh and magnetic anomalies. But the local news, sniffing a story, sent a young reporter to Maplewood to spend the night for a Halloween segment. He left before midnight, pale and tight-lipped, refusing to speak to anyone for a week. Clara scoured archives and newspaper records from across the state. All she found was the cemetery's strange history, an unclaimed mausoleum moved stone by stone from another county. A rash of vandalized statues in the late 1950s, a string of thunderstorms that had felled the oldest oak tree and split several grave markers. She called a retired professor from Tulane, an expert on Louisiana folk traditions. "Whispering statues? That is a story for the bayous," the professor said. "Older than any written record. It means the dead want something. The statues, they say, can become vessels for unspoken wishes, regrets, unfinished truths, especially where the earth is soft and the water runs near. If the whispers turn to wailing, leave and do not turn back." Meanwhile, Miles kept sending letters to his sister. Diagrams of statue placements, lists of names the statues seemed to whisper, and disturbing sketches of a particular figure. A pale, androgynous angel, crack running down one cheek, standing atop a square marble plinth at the heart of the oldest row. "Every night, that angel turns more and more towards the house," he wrote. "Last night I thought I heard it whisper Everett again. You should not come down here no matter what. I am trying to do some research before I go to the city officials. Something is not right with that statue." Several nights later, Miles called Clara, voice breaking. "Clara, tonight the whispering turned to pleading. I swear they said, 'Let us rest. Find the key. Let us rest.' Over and over. It was so loud I thought the neighbors would wake and come running. I walked through the rows until I reached the old communal crypt, the one with the locked iron door nobody has the key for. As I got close, the voices stopped all at once. The angel atop the crypt almost looked like it smiled. Clara pressed him for details. "What key? Did you ever find a key when Father died?" "Nothing like that. But I will look through the old desk in the office. If I find anything, I will call." That night turned to morning, then another sleepless day. At dusk, another letter came. Clara, I found the key, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of Father's desk drawer. There was a note tied to it in his writing. When the voices rise, return what was taken. I think I understand. Decades ago, a section of the cemetery was walled off during an epidemic. The city removed remains and reburied them in the communal crypt, but the records say not all personal effects were returned. Old superstition says the spirits would not rest unless all that was taken from them was given back. I am going to the crypt at midnight, alone. Your brother, Miles, Clara tried to call. No answer. Panicked, she called the sheriff, but the deputies, remembering the other night's whistling, refused to go, promising only to check at dawn. The next day, a single voicemail from Miles appeared on her phone, time-stamped 1:12 a.m. The static was so thick it scraped her ears. Through the distortion, she heard her brother's breath, ragged and fast, and a low chorus in the background, voices building and falling like the tide. Then, his whisper, "I am back at the crypt. The statues are all around me. The key fits. I am going to open it now, Clara," and then screaming metal, a sound like shifting stone, and the call cut out. He was gone. No one had seen him leave. The groundskeeper found the old communal crypt door standing open, nothing disturbed inside except for a pile of small ancient trinkets, beads and lockets, watches and pins, all laid out in the shape of a cross. The angel atop the tomb now faced away from the path and towards the swamp, its expression peaceful for the first time in living memory. Days passed. Then one evening, as the sun slipped behind the moss-draped branches, Clara received a final letter. The envelope was old and the edges soot-stained, but the handwriting was unmistakable, her brother's hand. "Clara, all is quiet now. The statues do not whisper anymore. I am safe, or as safe as one can be on holy ground. The dreams are gone. I hope you never have to see what I saw. If ever you need to find me, come to Maplewood at dusk and listen. The statues will only whisper welcome. Your brother, Miles." To this day, visitors to Maplewood Cemetery sometimes report as twilight falls that the statues seem to shift ever so slightly. Their lips pursed as if holding a silent message, their stone hands poised as though about to beckon. And if they listen very closely on certain humid Louisiana evenings, they say you can almost catch a gentle sigh across the crypts. A whisper of thanks, of peace, finally, found. I need to write this down while it's still fresh because honestly, I don't know if I'll believe it myself tomorrow. I'm sitting in my hotel room, hands still shaking, and I can't get the image out of my head. Today I decided to take that cemetery tour I've been putting off. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the one everyone calls the most haunted place in New Orleans. Perfect for my Halloween content series, right? The tour was supposed to end at 4 p.m., but I convinced the guide to let me stay behind for solo photos. Big mistake. Earlier today, 2:30 p.m. The tour group was typical. 15 tourists with cameras, college kids trying to look unimpressed, and one guy who kept asking if we'd see Marie Laveau's ghost. Our guide, Patricia, was this tiny Creole woman in her 60s who knew every story about every tomb. She kept warning us not to wander off and definitely not to stay after dark. The dead in St. Louis number 1, they don't all rest easy, she said, stopping in front of a crumbling above-ground vault. Some of them still got business with the living. I was getting great shots, afternoon light filtering through massive oak trees, weathered marble angels, elaborate ironwork like black lace against white tombs. This place is like a miniature city of the dead, with narrow pathways between vaults that rise up like tiny houses. Patricia told us about famous residents, Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen, whose tomb is covered in X marks from visitors seeking her help. But she also told darker stories about yellow fever epidemics that filled the cemetery faster than graves could be dug. "The cemetery closes at 3 p.m. sharp," Patricia warned as the tour ended. "Security locks the gates and you don't want to be trapped in here after sunset." 4:15 p.m. after the tour, I convinced Patricia I was a travel blogger and asked to stay 30 more minutes for photos. She looked at me like I'd asked to spend the night in a haunted house. "Child, I've been giving tours here for 23 years. When that sun starts going down, you get yourself to the exit gate." But I'm stubborn. My followers expect authentic content, right? I convinced the security guard, showed him my press credentials, promised I'd be out by 5 p.m. He reluctantly agreed but made me sign a waiver. The moment the tour group left, the atmosphere changed. It was still daylight, but shadows between the tombs seemed deeper. I was alone among hundreds of graves, and for the first time, that felt significant. 5 p.m., the encounter. I was photographing Marie Laveau's tomb when I heard crying. Soft at first, like someone trying to muffle their sobs. The crying got louder, coming from deeper in the cemetery. I followed the sound, thinking maybe someone else had gotten permission to stay late. That's when I saw her. She was the steps of a white marble tomb, hunched over with her face in her hands. She wore a long white dress that looked like it belonged in another century. Lots of lace, long sleeves, a full skirt that pooled around her feet. Her hair was dark and long, hanging loose around her shoulders. What struck me first was that she was barefoot. Her feet were dirty, like she'd been walking on unpaved ground for hours. "Are you okay?" I called out. The crying stopped immediately. She looked up at me and my heart stopped. Her face was beautiful but wrong somehow. Too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her eyes were dark and seemed too large for her face, but it was her expression that made me want to run. Such profound sadness that tears sprang to my own eyes. "You should not be here," she said. Her voice was soft with an accent I couldn't place. Not quite Creole, not quite French, but something older. "The sun is setting." I looked around. She was right. Somehow the light had faded to golden hour. Long shadows stretched between tombs. "I'm just finishing up some photos," I said. "Are you visiting someone?" She stood up slowly and I noticed she moved like she was floating. Her bare feet made no sound on the stone steps. "I am always here," she said. "I wait for those who do not listen to warnings." Something in her tone made my skin crawl. I took a step back, suddenly very aware that I was alone in a cemetery with someone who might not be stable. "I should go. The cemetery is closing soon." "Soon?" She tilted her head, and in the fading light her face seemed to shift. For just a moment I could have sworn I saw hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, skin like old parchment. But then she was beautiful again, just incredibly sad. "The cemetery closed an hour ago," she said. "The gates are locked. You are trapped here until dawn." My blood went cold. I pulled out my phone to call the security guard, but there was no signal. "That's not possible," I said. "The guard knows I'm here." She shook her head slowly. "He left. They always leave before dark. No one stays in St. Louis number 1 after sunset. No one living." I started walking quickly toward the front of the cemetery, but the path seemed different, longer, more twisted. The crying woman followed me, her bare feet silent on stone. "You should have listened," she said, keeping pace effortlessly. "Patricia warned you. She always warns them, but some never listen." "Who are you?" I asked. "I am what happens to those who stay too long. I am the warning that comes too late." I reached the front gate and rattled the iron bars, locked tight. The security booth was dark and empty. The woman stood behind me, and when I turned around, she was crying again. But now, in the last light of day, I could see that her tears were black. "Every night I wait here," she whispered. "Every night someone new joins me." I looked around desperately. The cemetery was much larger than it had seemed during the tour. Paths stretched in directions that hadn't existed before, and everywhere in the shadows between vaults I could see pale figures moving. "How do I get out?" I asked. "You don't. Not until dawn, but dawn is many hours away." 10:30 p.m. Still here. I've been writing this on my phone to keep myself sane. The battery is at 12%, but I need to document this. The crying woman was right. I'm trapped here until sunrise. She disappeared around 7 p.m., just faded away like mist. But I'm not alone. There are others here. Shadows that move between tombs. Whispers in languages I don't recognize. I found a sheltered spot between two large mausoleums. Every time I try to explore, the paths seem to shift. I end up back where I started. The temperature has dropped 20 degrees. My breath is visible, which is impossible for October in New Orleans. 2:15 a.m. Something's changed. The crying woman is back. She's sitting on Marie Laveau's tomb now, and she's not alone. There are others, men in old-fashioned suits, women in Victorian dresses, children in clothes from decades past. They're all sitting on various tombs, all perfectly still, all watching me. None of them are solid. I can see through them to the marble behind, but their eyes are so real, so full of sorrow. The crying woman beckoned to me. Against every instinct, I walked over to her. "You understand now," she said. "This place holds more than bodies. It holds the last moments of grief, the final tears of mourning. We are the sorrow that soaked into these stones over 2 centuries. What do you want from me? To witness, to remember, to carry our stories back to the living world. Too many come here seeking thrills. They don't understand that we were people once. We had names, lives, loves, losses." She told me her story then. Her name was Celeste Trem, and she had died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1853. She was 19 years old, engaged to be married in 2 weeks. She died alone in a charity hospital while her fiancé was traveling, and by the time he returned, she had already been buried in a mass grave. "I have been waiting here ever since," she said. "Waiting for someone to remember my name, to know that I existed, that I loved and was loved." The other spirits began to speak then, one by one. Each had a story, a name, a life cut short. They weren't trying to scare me, they were trying to be remembered. 5:45 a.m. Dawn approaches. The eastern sky is starting to lighten. The spirits are beginning to fade. Celeste is the last to go. "You will leave now," she said, "when the gate will open with the sunrise. But you will remember us, yes? You will tell their stories." I promised I would. As the first real light of dawn touched the tombs, I heard the click of the front gate unlocking. The fog lifted and the paths returned to their normal layout. I walked out of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 and into the awakening French Quarter. I looked back once. The cemetery looked ordinary in the morning light, just an old graveyard full of weathered tombs. But I could still feel their eyes on me, still hear the echo of Celeste's voice asking me to remember. Final thoughts. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I have no photos of the spirits. Every picture I took after sunset shows only empty tombs and shadows. But I have their names, their stories, their final requests. Maybe that's what really haunts places like St. Louis No. 1. Not malevolent ghosts seeking revenge, but forgotten souls seeking remembrance. The weight of stories untold, lives unrecorded, love and loss that soaked into the very stones. If you ever visit St. Louis Cemetery Number 1, please remember, these weren't just bodies laid to rest. They were people with stories worth telling, lives worth remembering. And maybe if you listen closely enough in the fading light of day, you might hear their whispers asking you to carry their memories back to the world of the living. They warned Detective Samuel Hutchins about Union Cemetery even before he took the job. On his first morning in Easton, the older officers snickered as they poured their coffee, jostling for an unobstructed view of the man from the city who thought a small-town police force would mean quiet finishes. "You'll be making house calls on raccoons after midnight if you're lucky," the sergeant said. "But sooner or later you'll pull an all-nighter at Union. That place does not like to be ignored." Samuel brushed off the tales at first. He was in his 40s with a salt and pepper beard and a thick New England accent. He had worked too many years in Bridgeport's violent crime unit to buy into white lady tales and whispers of vengeful spirits. He clung to routine, interviews, evidence bags, chain of command. Yet Union Cemetery had its own hold on the town, a reputation built from missing time and sudden chills, from bad luck wrecks on Stepney Road, from things that happened between the headstones at night that nobody wanted to name. The file landed on his desk in October, 100-year-old pages worn thin at the folds. Disappearances, unsolved deaths, ritual vandalism, marked by the signature crimson blooms of wild ivy, wound through the ornate iron fence that ringed the grounds. Initial crime scene, October 5th. That morning, Samuel was summoned by a frantic call from an elderly groundskeeper. Ivy's red, blood red, all up the Coleman family vault. Somebody's cut themselves, or worse, he arrived to find a strange, disturbing scene. Scarlet-stained vines encircled the Coleman crypt, twisting between the stone letters of beloved names. At their roots, the ground seemed freshly disturbed, though the cemetery had seen no burials in months. Despite the evidence of recent digging and something oddly sticky at the base of the stone, no bodies were found. Just a faded photograph of a young woman, on the back in painstaking cursive, "I'm sorry. Help me rest," locals clustered along the gate watching Samuel work. They did not murmur or ask questions. He got the sense they feared the answer. "Bad luck runs in ivy season," the oldest among them finally muttered. "It grows darkest where blood has been spilled, and it never leaves until the wrongs are buried for good." That evening, Samuel began his report with unusual trepidation. Union Cemetery Case File 1079. October 5th, 2018. Heavily disturbed soil at family crypt. Red-stained ivy. No sign of trespassers. Photograph of deceased placed with visible care. Possible vandalism? Locals extremely agitated. Recommend midnight patrol shifted to cemetery for next 2 weeks. Monitor for further disturbances. Midnight patrols. Field notes. Union Cemetery changed after sunset. The iron fence, ornate and rusting, seemed taller somehow, enclosing the headstones like stern, silent witnesses. Even the brisk October wind felt heavier, thick with the scent of wet moss and old perfume. His second night, Samuel heard footsteps moving lightly alongside the edge of the Coleman plot, where most stones were more than a century old. He called out, no response but a sudden coldness more gripping than the chill air. The patrol reports filled with similar occurrences, cameras glitching, batteries draining, radios bursting into static. Never did he catch sight of an actual trespasser, but twice he found red ivy newly coiled in the grass, winding toward other gravestones, always those with deaths marked unsolved. Samuel brought in local historian Marjorie Lane to interpret the photo left at the crypt. She pointed immediately to the style. A studio portrait from the 1940s, the subject a solemn young woman with a dark beauty, her features delicate, immortalized by the photographer's flash. "That's Evelyn Holt," Marjorie said. "She disappeared in 1947, never solved. Her mother always brought flowers, but never ivy. She feared it. The old families all do." "What happened to her?" Samuel pressed. "She was last seen leaving a Halloween dance." "They never found her body," the town whispered, sometimes loudly, about a spurned suitor or about the old curse. "There's always been a story of blood in the ivy at Union. Every few years when something ugly happens, the red vines come back. My grandmother said it started over 100 years ago, after a Civil War widow was denied burial for practicing witchcraft." Pattern: cold cases in red ivy. With Marjorie's help, Samuel cross-referenced the crypt vandalism with decades' worth of missing person and cold case files. He realized, shocked, that each time the red ivy bloomed out of season, someone in Easton had gone missing, or a body had been discovered in the woods nearby. Usually a Jane Doe never identified. He documented each instance, completing charts, marking patterns on a map. The cycle repeated, always with the same season of blood-streaked leaves, always circling back to graves holding unanswered questions. Deaths left in limbo, families never granted closure. One name kept reappearing: Cora Blake, a local girl vanished in 1978, whose mother had led candlelight vigils at her tomb for years. Her case was eerily similar to Evelyn Holt's. Even the town had whispered about their likeness, as if the curse chose its victims by resemblance or fate. Stranger evidence, night 5. On the 5th midnight patrol, a thick fog rolled into the cemetery. Samuel's flashlight beam barely pierced the shroud. At the heart of the old graveyard, near the Coleman plot, his radio spat static, and then a distinct whispering voice called out, "Help me rest." He spun. The air tasted cold and coppery, and atop the crypt stood a figure, at first appearing translucent, then unnervingly solid. A young woman, bruised like shadows under her eyes, an old-fashioned dress stained at the hem. She looked at Samuel and uttered, "You see me, do not," before flickering out like a dying bulb. The only trace she left was a single lock of auburn hair resting atop the photograph in his evidence bag. He collected it, fighting the surreal sense of death and time folding onto itself. Consultation. After-action memo. Samuel wrote up the encounter as unusual but left out the apparition, citing only possible prankster in period costume. Internally, doubt gnawed at him until his next meeting with Marjorie. "It's her," she insisted, voice trembling. "That's Evelyn's hair. Or Cora's. Or the White Lady. They're all the same. When the dead do not rest in Union, they beg for justice. The red ivy grows to mark their suffering. This cemetery holds more secrets than bones." He asked her about the curse. Marjorie described generations of blame laid at the feet of an old feud. Two families at war, resolved in a long-ago murder, never forgiven by the town and certainly not by the victims. The legend said the cemetery would remain restless until all wrongs were confessed and remembered. A breakthrough. The confession. Reluctantly, Samuel reopened old files. The Blevins family, whose patriarch was once a respected judge, had blocked town attempts to exhume a suspicious grave placed outside family boundaries, a Jane Doe interred in 1948 with no official ceremony. Samuel visited the grave, marked only MB 1948, and noticed new ivy growing at the base. He contacted a forensic anthropologist in New Haven and, after a week of paperwork and local outrage, secured an order to exhume. Inside the tiny burial, they discovered a skeleton, a blood-stained ribbon, and pieces of glass, consistent with a broken camera flashbulb from the 1940s. Marjorie wept when she saw the evidence. "That's Evelyn Holt. The hair, the ribbon, the camera. She was buried here without her name. DNA matched the last living Holt descendant." Samuel drafted his report in terse, clipped lines. Union Cemetery cold case closure. October 29th. Remains confirmed as Evelyn Holt. Family notified. Death ruled homicide. Investigation ongoing for original suspect. Red ivy receded from gravesite overnight. Evidence suggests ritual closure of long-standing pattern. Halloween night. Atonement and release. The town gathered at Union Cemetery under the cautious watch of the police. Marjorie led a candlelit procession among the tombs, reading out the names of those lost, restoring their stories to memory. Local clergy, standing side by side with agnostic townsfolk, read a blessing for each lost soul. Afterward, Detective Hutchins watched from near the Coleman crypt. The ground was still, the red ivy browning and curling away from the stone, returning to its normal green as the sun rose. The townspeople felt the shift. Neighbors spoke about better dreams, quieter nights, and children who stopped waking, shrieking from night terrors. A week later, Samuel was promoted to chief investigator, not for closing a case officially, but for restoring peace. After-action thoughts. Sam's private log. Samuel told no one about his last midnight round in Union Cemetery. Armed with a lantern, he walked the now peaceful paths. At the Coleman crypt, in fading moonlight, he heard the rustle of leaves. Just nature, he told himself. Yet as he passed the place where the red ivy had once crowned the stones, he caught sight of two silhouettes. Young women in old dresses standing side by side and holding hands. They gazed at him with gratitude, then faded into the mist. He left the photograph of Evelyn on her freshly marked grave with the words she'd written, "I'm sorry. Help me rest." And for the first time, a warm wind swept through Union Cemetery, bearing the scent of roses instead of blood and fear. Union's curse was never spoken of again, but in every October after, someone would spot a flicker of white moving under the maples, hear a voice on the wind, or find an old red bloom curling around a mossy gate. Reminders that forgotten wrongs can linger unless the living have the courage to name them. And so, Detective Hutchins' report closed not on a neat signed sentence but a warning, a nod to future generations. The blood in the ivy at Union Cemetery is not just a stain, it is a message from the silenced. Listen _ The static cut through the October air like fingernails on chalkboard, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. Tasha Sinclair adjusted her headset and checked the battery indicator on her body cam for the third time in 10 minutes. The red recording light blinked steadily in the darkness, capturing every sound, every shadow, every moment of what would become the most disturbing investigation of her paranormal research career. Paranormal Investigation Unit 7, Westminster Hall Cemetery, Baltimore, Maryland, she whispered into her microphone. October 28th, 11:47 p.m. Temperature 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Present team members, myself, Jake Morrison, and David Chen. Behind her, Jake struggled with the infrared camera equipment, cursing under his breath as the tripod legs refused to lock properly on the uneven ground. David stood near the wrought iron fence, electromagnetic field detector in hand, watching the digital readout fluctuate wildly despite the absence of any electrical equipment in the vicinity. "This place is already lighting up like a Christmas tree," David muttered, tapping the EMF detector with his finger. "We're getting readings across the entire spectrum and we haven't even made it past the entrance yet." Westminster Hall and burying ground had been on their list for months. As paranormal investigators specializing in historical hauntings, the team knew the cemetery's reputation well. Dating back to 1786, it was the final resting place of Edgar Allan Poe, whose grave attracted thousands of visitors each year. But it was the other stories, the whispered legends passed down through generations of Baltimore residents, that had brought them here on this cold October night. The screaming skull. "Jake, you getting audio on this?" Tasha asked, adjusting her own equipment as they walked deeper into the cemetery. The ancient headstones rose around them like crooked teeth, some so weathered that the names and dates had been worn smooth by 2 centuries of Maryland weather. "Yeah, everything's recording, but Tash, I'm picking up something weird on the background audio. Listen to this." He rewound 30 seconds of footage and played it back through his headphones, then passed them to Tasha. Through the crackling static, she could hear their own voices, clear and distinct. But underneath, almost subliminal, was something else. A low rhythmic sound that might have been breathing or might have been something trying to speak. "Could be wind through the trees," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "What wind?" David asked, gesturing around them. The air was perfectly still, so quiet they could hear traffic from downtown Baltimore, several miles away. Even the usual night sounds of the city seemed muffled here, as if the cemetery existed in its own pocket of silence. They had done their research thoroughly before coming. The legend of Westminster's screaming skull dated back to the 1800s, when a minister named Reverend Samuel Morrison had been found murdered in the cemetery, his body brutally beaten and left among the graves. According to the stories, his skull had been separated from his body during the attack, and for weeks afterward, residents reported hearing screams emanating from the graveyard every night at exactly midnight. The screaming became so disruptive that city officials finally exhumed the minister's remains. They found his skull in a different location from the rest of his body, and local residents swore they could see it moving, jaw opening and closing as if trying to speak. In desperation, they gagged the skull and encased it in a concrete block, which was then placed beside the minister's reconstructed grave. "There," David said, pointing toward the older section of the cemetery. "That's got to be it." About 50 yards ahead, a crude concrete monument stood apart from the more elegant headstones surrounding it. Unlike the carved marble and granite memorials nearby, this was clearly a utilitarian structure, built for containment rather than commemoration. Even from a distance, it seemed to radiate an aura of wrongness that made Tasha's skin crawl. "Temperature just dropped 15 degrees, Jake announced, checking his digital thermometer. "We went from 62 to 47 in the space of about 10 steps. As they approached the concrete block, their equipment began malfunctioning in earnest. The EMF detector's needle shot to maximum and stayed there, while Jake's infrared camera started recording phantom heat signatures, human-shaped warm spots that appeared and disappeared faster than the eye could follow. "Look at this," Tasha said, kneeling beside the monument. The concrete was old and weather-stained, but carved into its surface were deep scratches that looked disturbingly like claw marks. These weren't made by animals. David circled the monument with his camera, documenting every angle. "The scratches are definitely deliberate. Look at the pattern. They're concentrated around what would be the mouth area if this really does contain a skull." "Guys," Jake interrupted, his voice tense. "Check your audio levels." They all fell silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the ambient city noise filtering through the cemetery. Then gradually they began to hear it. A low, muffled sound coming from somewhere near the concrete block. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but with an undertone of desperation that made it unmistakably human. "Is that—" Tasha began. "Shh." David held up a hand, motioning for complete silence. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely coming from the direction of the monument, and it was definitely the sound of something trying to scream through a gag. The rhythm matched that of human speech, rapid, frantic, as if someone was trying desperately to communicate. 11:58, Jake whispered, checking his watch. 2 minutes to midnight. The muffled screaming intensified, becoming so loud that their recording equipment began picking up distortion. Tasha felt her heart hammering as she watched the needle on the EMF detector dance frantically across the entire spectrum. The temperature continued to drop, and their breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. "This is impossible," David said, but his voice shook. "The concrete is 3 inches thick. There's no way sound could carry through that, even if there was something inside." At exactly midnight, the screaming reached a crescendo that made all 3 investigators step back from the monument. The sound was no longer muffled. It was clear, piercing, unmistakably the cry of someone in agony. But more than that, it was trying to form words. "Help!" The voice screamed through what sounded like cloth or rope. "Help me! Find him! Make him pay!" Jake's camera captured it all, the audio, the temperature readings, the electromagnetic spikes. But more importantly, it captured something none of them saw with their naked eyes until they reviewed the footage later. At the moment of the loudest screaming, a translucent figure appeared beside the monument. A man in clerical clothing, his face a mask of rage and pain, pointing frantically toward the newer section of the cemetery. The screaming continued for exactly 3 minutes, then cut off abruptly. The temperature began to rise, their equipment readings returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over them lifted like a weight being removed from their shoulders. "Did you guys see?" Tasha started. "The figure?" "Yeah, I saw it," David said, his face pale. "Jake, please tell me the camera caught that." "Everything's recorded," Jake confirmed, though his hands were trembling as he checked the equipment. Temperature, audio, EMF readings, and whatever the hell that was we just witnessed. They spent another hour in the cemetery documenting everything they could, but the paranormal activity had ceased completely. It was as if the screaming had said everything it needed to say, and the spirit had returned to whatever dark corner of existence it normally occupied. Back at their research facility, they spent days analyzing the footage. The audio was clear and undeniable, the sound of a human voice screaming through a gag, forming recognizable words. The electromagnetic readings showed spikes that couldn't be explained by any natural phenomenon. And the thermal imaging had captured the unmistakable outline of a human figure that appeared and disappeared in perfect synchronization with the screaming. But it was David who made the most disturbing discovery. "I've been researching Reverend Morrison's murder," he told the team during their debriefing session. According to newspaper accounts from 1847, he was investigating financial irregularities in the church. He'd discovered that someone was embezzling money from the collection plates and using it to buy land around the cemetery for development. "So he was killed to keep him quiet," Tasha said. "That's what I thought. But here's the thing. The murder was never solved. The prime suspect was Morrison's assistant, a man named Jonathan Blackwood, but he had an alibi. He was supposedly visiting his sick mother in Philadelphia the night of the murder." David pulled out a manila folder filled with photocopied newspaper clippings and cemetery records. "But I kept digging and I found something interesting. 3 months after Morrison's murder, Blackwood suddenly had enough money to buy a large plot in the newer section of Westminster Cemetery. He built an elaborate mausoleum for himself and his family, even though he was only 35 years old and in perfect health. "You think the figure was pointing toward Blackwood's grave?" Jake said. "I think Reverend Morrison is still trying to identify his killer," David replied. "And I think Jonathan Blackwood got away with murder for almost 200 years." They returned to Westminster Cemetery the following month, this time focusing their investigation on the Blackwood Mausoleum. What they found there would become the subject of their most controversial research paper. Evidence that seemed to suggest the paranormal activity at Westminster wasn't random haunting, but a systematic attempt by the dead to seek justice for unresolved crimes. The screaming skull continued to wail every night at midnight, but now Tasha understood it wasn't screaming in pain. It was screaming for justice, demanding that the truth finally be heard after nearly 2 centuries of silence. And sometimes late at night when the city grew quiet, Baltimore residents still reported hearing those muffled cries echoing from Westminster Cemetery, the voice of a murdered minister who refused to rest until his killer's name was finally spoken aloud. They say the dying see things the living cannot. In my 87 years walking this earth, I never believed such foolishness until Dr. Harrison told me the tumors in my lungs had spread to my spine, my liver, my brain. 3 months, maybe 4 if I was lucky. Time enough to set affairs in order, he said, to say goodbyes. But some goodbyes cannot be spoken to the living. My name is Walter Pennington, Walt to those who knew me before my hair went white and my back bent double. I was born in Knoxville in 1937, raised in the shadow of the Smoky Mountains by a grandmother who claimed she could speak to spirits and a grandfather who dismissed such notions as mountain superstition. I spent my childhood caught between their competing truths, never knowing which to believe until the night I first saw the Watcher. I was 8 years old, walking through Old Gray Cemetery on a dare from Tommy Morrison and his gang of bullies. The Victorian graveyard sprawled across 45 acres of hills and hollows in East Knoxville, its elaborate monuments and weathered headstones creating a maze of shadows in the moonlight. The older boys had bet me a silver dollar I wouldn't spend an hour alone among the graves after midnight. My family needed that dollar. Times were hard in 1945, and my father had not returned from the war. I entered through the main gate on Broadway, clutching a pocket watch my grandmother had given me. The cemetery felt different at night, alive with whispers I could not quite hear and movement I could not quite see. Every statue seemed to turn its head as I passed. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps on gravel paths. I had made it halfway through my hour when I saw him. He stood beside the Wilder family mausoleum, a figure in clothes that seemed to shimmer between shadow and substance. Tall and gaunt, wearing a long coat that hung from his shoulders like funeral drapes. His face was pale and sharp-featured, with hollow eyes that reflected the moonlight like pools of still water. He was watching me with an expression of profound sadness, as if my presence in that place brought him great pain. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. But instead of approaching or speaking, he simply raised one skeletal hand and pointed toward the cemetery's older section, where the headstones dated back to the 1800s. Then, without a sound, he melted back into the shadows between the tombs. I ran from Old Gray that night, never claiming my silver dollar, never speaking of what I had seen. But as I grew older, I found myself drawn back to the cemetery again and again. During my teenage years, I would walk the winding paths on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly visiting the grave of a distant relative, but really searching for another glimpse of the figure I had come to think of as the Watcher. He appeared to me 7 more times over the decades, always in the same place beside the Wilder mausoleum, always pointing toward the older graves with that same expression of inexplicable sorrow. In 1952, the night before I shipped out for Korea. In 1958, when I returned home to bury my grandmother. In 1963, the week I married my beloved Sarah. In 1971, on the day our son Michael was born. In 1984, when Sarah's cancer finally claimed her. In 1997, at Michael's funeral after the car accident that took him far too young. And most recently, just 6 months ago, on the night I first felt the sharp pain in my chest that would lead to Dr. Harrison's grim diagnosis. Each time I saw the Watcher, something significant happened in my life within days. A departure, a return, a beginning, an ending. He appeared at the threshold moments, the times when one phase of existence gave way to another, I came to understand that he was not trying to frighten me, but to prepare me, to mark the passages that shape a human life. Now, as October rain drums against the windows of my small house on Magnolia Avenue, I know why he has haunted my steps for nearly 80 years. I know where he was pointing all those times, and I know what he was trying to tell me. The older section of Old Gray Cemetery, established in 1850, contains graves that predate the Great Yellow Fever epidemic of 1854. Hundreds died that summer as the disease swept through Knoxville like a prairie fire, and the cemetery expanded rapidly to accommodate the dead. New plots were laid out in neat rows, modern and efficient compared to the haphazard arrangement of the earlier graves. But in their haste to bury the fever victims, the cemetery planners made a terrible mistake. They built the new section directly over an older burial ground, a small family plot that had been forgotten by everyone except the spirits who dwelt there. The Pennington family plot, my family's plot. I discovered this truth 3 weeks ago while researching my genealogy, hoping to leave my descendants some record of their heritage. Hidden in the basement archives of the Knox County Library, I found a deed dated 1849. Jeremiah Pennington, my great-great-grandfather, had purchased a small parcel of land in what would later become Old Gray Cemetery. The deed described a family burial ground containing the graves of his parents, his wife, and 3 children who had died in infancy. When the yellow fever struck 5 years later, the overwhelmed cemetery authorities apparently lost track of the old family plots. They platted new graves directly over the Pennington burial ground, erecting elaborate Victorian monuments where simple stone markers had once stood. My ancestors were not moved or reinterred. They were simply built over, forgotten, their resting place defiled by the pressing needs of the living. The Watcher was not some random spirit haunting Old Gray Cemetery. He was Jeremiah Pennington, my great-great-grandfather, pointing toward his desecrated family graves and waiting 80 years for one of his descendants to understand his message. Tonight, armed with this knowledge and facing my own approaching end, I returned to Old Gray Cemetery one final time. The October night was cold and damp, with fog rolling off the Tennessee River and settling among the monuments like a burial shroud. I carried with me a bouquet of mountain laurel, Sarah's favorite flower, and a letter I had written to the cemetery authorities documenting my family's rightful claim to the disputed ground. I walked slowly through the familiar paths, my oxygen tank wheeling behind me on its small cart. The elaborate Victorian monuments loomed out of the mist like ships in a ghostly harbor. Angels with weathered faces gazed down at me with expressions of eternal sorrow. Obelisks and crosses reached toward the clouded sky like fingers of the dead grasping for heaven. The Wilder family mausoleum stood unchanged, its granite walls streaked with decades of rain and neglect. I positioned myself beside it and waited, knowing with absolute certainty that the Watcher would come. He materialized from the fog at 11:57, exactly as I remembered him from my childhood. Tall and gaunt in his old-fashioned coat, with hollow eyes that held depths of sadness no living person could fathom. But this time, when our eyes met, I saw recognition in his gaze, understanding, relief. "I know who you are," I whispered into the cold night air. "I know what you've been trying to tell me all these years." Jeremiah Pennington, the Watcher, the shadow that had followed me through 8 decades of life, smiled for the first time. It transformed his gaunt features, making him appear almost human despite his translucent form. He nodded once, slowly, then beckoned for me to follow. Together we walked toward the older section of the cemetery. My steps were labored, my breathing shallow, but I forced myself to keep pace with the spirit of my ancestor. He led me to a cluster of elaborate Victorian graves, monuments to families whose names meant nothing to me now, but who had been buried atop the bones of my people. The watcher stopped beside a particularly ornate memorial, a marble angel with outstretched wings that had been erected in 1855. He knelt beside the monument and placed his spectral hand against the earth at its base. "Here," he said, his voice like wind through autumn leaves. "They are here. All of them, waiting to be remembered." I knelt beside him, my aged joints protesting, and placed the mountain laurel on the ground where he indicated. As I did, I felt them, a stirring in the earth beneath my palms, the presence of souls who had been forgotten for more than a century and a half. "I'll make this right," I promised, pulling out the letter I had written to the cemetery authorities. "They'll know the truth. Your family will be remembered." Jeremiah Pennington rose to his full height and looked down at me with an expression of profound gratitude. The weight of sorrow that had defined his existence for so many years was lifting from his shoulders like fog before the morning sun. "Thank you," he whispered, and in his voice I heard not just his gratitude but that of all the forgotten dead, all the souls whose resting places had been lost to time and human oversight. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern hills, the watcher began to fade. His form became less substantial with each passing moment, his features blurring into the morning mist. But before he disappeared entirely, he raised his hand one final time, not pointing now, but waving farewell. I sat by that unmarked grave until full daylight, breathing in the autumn air and feeling the pain in my chest ease for the first time in months. The watcher was gone. His vigil finally ended. The weight of his unfinished business had passed to me, but I carried it gladly. I had 3 months to live, maybe 4, and I would use every day to ensure that Jeremiah Pennington and his forgotten family received the recognition they deserved. They found me there the next morning, slumped peacefully against the marble angel, the letter clutched in my lifeless hands. The cemetery groundskeeper said later that my face bore the most serene expression he had ever seen on a dead man, as if I had finally found the peace that had eluded me in life. Old Gray Cemetery is quieter now. Visitors no longer report seeing a gaunt figure watching from the shadows, and the oppressive atmosphere that once clung to the older section has lifted like a curse finally broken. The Pennington family graves have been properly marked and maintained, their story added to the cemetery's official records. But sometimes, on foggy October nights when the veil between worlds grows thin, groundskeepers claim to see 2 figures walking together among the monuments. An old man with a wheeled oxygen tank and a tall figure in an antique coat, no longer separate by death but united in the completion of a task that spanned nearly a century. The watcher's vigil is ended, but the love that bound him to his family and to me endures beyond the grave. The first time Marissa Caldwell saw the little girl in black, she was pushing her twin daughters on the swings at Greenwood Memorial Park in Riverside, California. It was a crisp Saturday morning in October, the kind of perfect Southern California day that makes you forget the summer heat and appreciate the gentle warmth of autumn sunshine. Emma and Sophie, both 6 years old, squealed with delight as their swings carried them higher into the cloudless blue sky. That's when Marissa noticed her standing at the edge of the playground watching. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in a formal black dress that seemed oddly old-fashioned, like something from a vintage photograph. The dress had puffy sleeves and a high neckline, with rows of tiny buttons marching up the front like dark pearls. Her long, dark hair was parted severely down the middle and tied back with a black ribbon. But it was her stillness that caught Marissa's attention. She stood perfectly motionless, her pale hands folded in front of her, watching the twins with an expression of profound longing. "Mommy, who's that girl?" Emma asked, pointing toward the strange figure. Marissa looked again, but the child was gone. The edge of the playground was empty except for a maintenance worker trimming hedges near the cemetery gates. "What girl, honey?" Marissa asked, slowing Emma's swing. "The sad girl in the black dress." She was watching us. Sophie nodded vigorously from her own swing. She looked like she wanted to play, but she seemed scared to come over. Marissa scanned the playground again. A few other families were enjoying the morning, parents pushing toddlers on swings, older children racing down slides. But she saw no child in black anywhere. "I don't see anyone, girls." Maybe it was just shadows from the trees. But as they walked back to their car, parked along the service road that separated the playground from Greenwood Cemetery, Marissa found herself glancing over her shoulder. The cemetery stretched across 50 acres of gently rolling hills, dotted with oak trees and filled with headstones dating back to the early 1900s. Many of the older graves belonged to children, victims of diseases that modern medicine had long since conquered. It wasn't until their third visit to the playground that Marissa saw the child herself. She was sitting on a bench near the back fence, the one that offered a clear view of both the playground and the older section of the cemetery beyond. Emma and Sophie were playing on the jungle gym with two other children they'd met, their laughter carrying across the warm afternoon air. Marissa was reading a book, occasionally glancing up to check on the girls when movement caught her eye. The child in black sat on a weathered stone bench about 30 yards away, positioned so she could watch the playground through the chain-link fence. She was older than Marissa had initially thought, perhaps 10 or 11, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak branches. Her black dress was even more elaborate than Marissa remembered, with intricate beadwork around the collar and cuffs. But it was the child's expression that made Marissa's breath catch in her throat. The longing was so intense it was almost physical, as if she were pressing her face against glass, desperate to join the other children but unable to cross some invisible barrier. Marissa stood up, intending to walk over and perhaps invite the child to join her daughters at play. But as soon as she took a step forward, the girl looked directly at her. Their eyes met across the distance, and Marissa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze. The child's eyes were dark and fathomless, filled with a sadness that no child should ever have to carry. For a moment that felt like hours, they stared at each other. Then the girl slowly shook her head as if warning Marissa away, and simply faded like morning mist. Not vanished, faded, becoming more and more transparent until only the empty bench remained. That evening, Marissa called the Riverside County Parks Department to ask about the cemetery next to the playground. The woman who answered the phone was helpful but seemed puzzled by Marissa's questions about children's graves in the older section. "Greenwood's been serving the community since 1908, she explained. "There are thousands of graves there, including quite a few children from the early days when childhood diseases were more common. Is there a specific grave you're looking for? A family member, perhaps?" "No, I was just curious about the history of the area. Has anyone ever reported strange occurrences at the playground? Children seeing things that aren't there?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Well, that's an odd question, but now that you mention it, we do get occasional reports from parents about their kids talking to imaginary friends while playing there. Usually children claiming to see other kids who want to play but never actually join in. The playground's been there since the late 70s, and the reports have been fairly consistent over the years." Marissa felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of reports?" "Oh, nothing harmful. Just children asking their parents about the shy girl or the sad boy they saw watching from near the cemetery fence. Kids have active imaginations, especially in a setting like that. The proximity to the cemetery probably makes them think about ghosts and such." Have any parents actually seen these children? Another pause. Not that I'm aware of. It's always secondhand through the children. But Marissa had seen her. Clear as day, solid as any living person until that final moment when she faded away like a photograph left too long in the sun. Over the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent. Sometimes the child in black would be sitting on the bench watching the playground with that heartbreaking expression of longing. Other times she would be standing near the fence, her fingers wrapped around the chain links as if she were imprisoned behind them. Once Marissa saw her walking slowly along the cemetery's border, always staying in the shadow of the trees, always watching the playing children with those dark, sad eyes. Emma and Sophie seemed to sense her presence too, though they never mentioned seeing her again after that first day. But they began asking questions that made Marissa uncomfortable. "Mommy, why can't some children play with other children?" Emma asked one afternoon as they drove home from the playground. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Some children have to stay by themselves all the time. That's not fair." Sophie nodded solemnly from her car seat. "The sad girl wants to play with us, but something won't let her. She has to stay on the other side." "What other side?" Marissa asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. "The quiet side," Sophie said matter-of-factly, "where the sleeping people are." That evening, Marissa drove back to Greenwood Cemetery alone. She parked outside the main gates and walked through the entrance, past the newer sections with their neat rows of modern headstones toward the older area that bordered the playground. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the weathered marble monuments glow like candles. Marissa walked slowly through the older section, reading names and dates, noting how many of the graves belonged to children who had died more than a century ago. She found what she was looking for near a cluster of oak trees that provided a perfect view of the playground beyond the fence. A small headstone, simple and unadorned compared to the elaborate monuments nearby. The inscription was worn but still readable. Helena Rose Blackwood. Beloved daughter, 1902 to 1912. She loved to watch the children play. Below the epitaph was a carving of a little girl in a formal dress, her hair pulled back with a ribbon, her hands folded primly in front of her. Even rendered in weathered stone, the resemblance to the child Marissa had been seeing was unmistakable. A small American flag had been placed next to the headstone, along with a bouquet of black roses that looked fresh despite the October heat. A brass plaque near the base of the stone provided additional information. Helena Rose Blackwood died of consumption in 1912 at the age of 10. According to family records, she spent her final months bedridden in the family home, watching other children play in the garden below her window. Her greatest wish was to join them, but her illness prevented her from leaving her room. She was buried in this spot specifically because it offered a view of the area where local children gathered to play. Marissa knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the cool stone. As she did, she felt a presence beside her, not threatening, but achingly sad. "Hello, Helena," she whispered. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and for just a moment she saw the child in black standing next to the headstone. But this time, instead of longing, Helena's expression showed gratitude. She smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her pale features, and nodded once before fading away. The next day, Marissa brought Emma and Sophie to the playground as usual, but this time she also brought something extra. A small bouquet of white flowers and a handwritten note. While the girls played, she walked to the cemetery fence and placed the flowers near the spot where she had so often seen Helena watching. The note was simple. For Helena Rose Blackwood. You are remembered. You are not alone. As they prepared to leave that afternoon, Emma tugged on Marissa's sleeve. "Mommy, the sad girl isn't sad anymore." "What do you mean, honey?" "She's smiling now," and she waved goodbye. Marissa looked toward the cemetery but saw only sunlight filtering through the oak trees and the gentle movement of branches in the autumn breeze. But somehow she knew that Helena Rose Blackwood's long vigil was finally over. After more than a century of watching from the shadows, she had been seen, acknowledged, and remembered. The child in black was no longer alone. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we are confronting a new realm of fear with 8 of the most disturbing true home alone horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not urban legends or recycled narratives. They are painstakingly compiled from genuine reports and first-hand submissions, retold with utmost respect for the harrowing experiences behind them. Each tale unfurls a unique nightmare, from uninvited stalkers to silent intruders hidden in the walls, reminding us that the terror of isolation sometimes arises from real and lurking threats. While some names and identifying details have been modified to safeguard those who survived these ordeals, the authenticity and gravity of what transpired remains completely intact. If you value real horror from the dark corners of true life, you are in the right place. Be sure to subscribe to Buried Files for more in-depth accounts that will haunt your nights, and activate notifications so you never miss when the unknown comes knocking. My name is Marcus Johnson, and what I am about to share happened during my junior year at Arizona State University. I had been living in a rental house near campus with 2 roommates, but when winter break arrived in December, they both went home to their families while I stayed behind to work at a local restaurant. The extra shifts meant good money, and honestly, I welcomed the quiet after months of constant noise and chaos. The house was a typical college rental, a 2-story place built in the 1970s with a finished basement that we used as a hangout space. It had wood paneling, old carpet, and a separate entrance that led directly outside through metal storm doors. We rarely locked those basement doors since we figured nobody would want to steal our beat-up furniture and gaming consoles. For the first few days alone, everything felt normal. I would wake up, grab breakfast, head to work, and return home to an empty house. The silence was actually refreshing. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing small things that did not quite make sense. My milk carton, which had been nearly full when I left for my shift, was almost empty when I returned home. I blamed it on my poor memory. Maybe I had been drinking more than I realized. Then my leftover pizza disappeared from the refrigerator. Again, I convinced myself that I must have eaten it late one night and forgotten. The missing food bothered me, but I tried to rationalize it away. College life had trained me to assume that everything had a logical explanation, even when it did not feel right. I started writing down what food I had before leaving for work just to keep track. Sure enough, items kept vanishing. A half loaf of bread gone, an entire container of deli turkey missing, crackers disappearing from the pantry. The pattern was consistent. Someone was taking just enough to eat, but not so much that it would be immediately obvious. Whoever was doing this knew how to avoid detection. I began to suspect that one of my roommates had returned early and was playing some kind of elaborate prank. I searched their rooms looking for signs that they had come back without telling me, but everything remained exactly as they had left it. Their beds were still unmade, their belongings undisturbed. That was when I started paying attention to other details around the house. The basement television had been left on one morning when I was certain I had turned it off the night before. The couch cushions were arranged differently than how I remembered them. Small changes that could easily be dismissed as forgetfulness, but the accumulation was becoming impossible to ignore. I decided to test my theory. Before leaving for work one Thursday morning, I carefully arranged items in the basement in specific ways. A magazine placed at an exact angle on the coffee table, couch pillows positioned precisely, the television remote set in an unusual spot. When I returned that evening, everything had been moved. The magazine was on the floor, the pillows were bunched up as if someone had been sleeping on them. The remote was on the opposite side of the room. Someone had definitely been in my house while I was gone, and they were making themselves comfortable in the basement. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I tell them? That my food was disappearing and my furniture was moving? They would think I was paranoid or making things up. I needed more concrete proof before involving authorities. Instead, I decided to set up my own surveillance system. I positioned my laptop in the basement with its camera facing the main living area and set it to record while I was at work. The battery would not last all day, but it might capture something useful. The next evening, I rushed home and immediately checked the recording. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The basement remained empty and still. But then, at the 3-hour mark, I watched in absolute horror as the basement door opened and a man emerged from behind the water heater. He was middle-aged, wearing dirty clothes that looked like they had not been changed in weeks. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and he moved through the basement with the confidence of someone who knew the layout intimately. He walked to the couch, sat down, and turned on the television as if he owned the place. I watched in stunned silence as this stranger ate my food, used my bathroom, and made himself completely at home. He had clearly been living in my basement for an unknown amount of time, hiding behind the water heater during the day and emerging when I was gone. The water heater area was in a dark corner that we never accessed, hidden behind some old boxes and holiday decorations. The recording showed him staying active for several hours before disappearing back behind the water heater. He knew my schedule. He knew exactly when I left for work and when I would return. This had been going on for who knows how long, and I had been completely oblivious. My hands shook as I called 911. The dispatcher seemed skeptical at first, but when I explained that I had video evidence of someone living in my basement without permission, she took me seriously. Police arrived within 20 minutes, and I showed them the recording. 4 officers searched the house while I waited outside. They found his makeshift living space behind the water heater, a sleeping bag, bottles of water, and containers for human waste. He had created a small but functional living area in the darkest corner of the basement, complete with stolen food items and personal belongings that I had assumed were lost or misplaced over the months. The man was not there when they searched, but they found evidence that he had been coming and going through the basement storm doors, which had a broken lock that we had never bothered to fix. He had probably been watching the house for weeks before moving in, learning our routines and finding the perfect hiding spot. Officers told me that this was more common than people realized. Empty or partially occupied homes near college campuses were frequent targets for transients looking for temporary shelter. They often chose basements, attics, or other rarely used spaces where they could hide during the day and move around when residents were gone. The police set up surveillance and caught him 2 days later when he returned to collect his belongings. He had been living in my basement for over 6 weeks, surviving on stolen food and using our utilities. During questioning, he admitted that he had been in the house even when my roommates were there. But it was much easier to move around freely when I was alone. What disturbed me most was learning that he had been watching me sleep. He knew my schedule so well because he had been observing me for weeks, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, and when I left for work. He had complete access to the house and had been moving through it silently while I was unconscious upstairs. The man was arrested for breaking and entering, burglary, and criminal trespass. He had a history of similar incidents and had been homeless for several years. The police explained that he probably chose our house because it looked like a typical college rental. Easy access, minimal security, and residents who were often away. I could not sleep in that house for weeks afterward. Every sound made me wonder if someone else was hiding somewhere, waiting for me to leave or fall asleep. We installed new locks, security cameras, and motion sensors throughout the house. I checked behind that water heater obsessively, even though I knew it was empty. My roommates returned from break to find the house transformed into a fortress. When I explained what had happened, they were horrified but also fascinated. They wanted to see the video and hear every detail about how someone had been living with us without our knowledge. The story spread quickly through our friend group and became legendary on campus, but for me it was not an interesting story to share at parties. It was a fundamental violation of safety and security that changed how I viewed private spaces forever. The idea that someone can secretly share your home, watch your routines, and live off your resources without detection is terrifying in a way that few people truly understand unless they have experienced it. Even now, years later, I still check behind water heaters and in dark corners whenever I move to a new place. I secure every possible entry point and remain hyper-vigilant about unexplained changes in my environment. That experience taught me that home invasion does not always involve broken windows or kicked-in doors. Sometimes the most dangerous intruders are the ones you never know are there. The basement tenant had been my unwelcome roommate for over a month, and if I had not started paying attention to the small details, he might have continued living there indefinitely. That realization still gives me chills, knowing that someone was sharing my space, breathing the same air, and watching my life unfold from the shadows. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I am a single mother living in Tampa, Florida. What happened to me 3 months ago still makes me question everything I thought I knew about safety and technology. It was a Tuesday night in June when Hurricane Debbie was approaching the coast, bringing with it the kind of electrical storms that turn the sky into a war zone. My daughter Sophia was only 8 months old at the time, and like most new mothers, I had become obsessed with monitoring her sleep. I had installed one of those high-tech baby monitors with video and audio capabilities, the kind that connects to your phone and promises to give you peace of mind. The base unit sat on Sophia's dresser, and I kept the handheld receiver with me wherever I went in the house. That particular evening, the storm had knocked out power to half the neighborhood, but our house still had electricity. The wind was howling outside and rain pelted against the windows with such force that I worried the glass might crack. Sophia had been fussy all day because of the atmospheric pressure, but she had finally fallen asleep around 8 o'clock. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when the baby monitor started acting strangely. Instead of the usual soft static or gentle breathing sounds from Sophia's room, I began hearing what sounded like fragments of conversation. At first, I assumed it was interference from other electronic devices in the neighborhood, something that occasionally happened during storms. The voices were faint and distorted, cutting in and out with the static. I could not make out specific words, but there seemed to be at least 2 people talking back and forth. I walked closer to Sophia's room to check if the sounds were actually coming from there, but when I peeked inside, she was sleeping peacefully. The voices were definitely coming through the monitor, not from the room itself. I tried adjusting the frequency settings, thinking maybe the device was picking up radio transmissions or signals from another baby monitor in the area. But as I fiddled with the controls, the voices became clearer, and what I heard made my blood run cold. A man's voice said, "She put the baby down about 20 minutes ago." Then a second voice, also male, replied, "Good. Give it another hour before we make our move." I stood frozen in my kitchen, gripping the monitor so tightly that my knuckles turned white. These were not random radio signals or crossed wires from another family's baby monitor. These people were talking about me and Sophia, and they seemed to know our schedule with frightening accuracy. The conversation continued sporadically over the next few minutes, always with the same two voices discussing details about our house and routine. They mentioned that I usually went to bed around 10:30 and that I always checked on Sophia one last time before turning off the lights. They knew which rooms had windows facing the street and which ones were hidden from view. My first instinct was to call 911, but I hesitated because I knew how crazy it would sound. What would I tell them? That my baby monitor was picking up voices of people planning to break into my house? They would probably assume I was having some kind of postpartum anxiety episode or that the storm was making me paranoid. Instead, I decided to investigate further. I grabbed my phone and started recording the audio from the baby monitor, hoping to capture evidence of what I was hearing. The voices came and went with the static, but I managed to record several minutes of clear conversation. "The back door looks like the easiest entry point," one voice said. "No deadbolt, just a regular handle lock." "What about the dog?" the second voice asked. "There is no dog. I've been watching for 3 days. Just her and the baby." My legs nearly gave out when I heard that. Someone had been watching my house for 3 days, studying our routines and planning some kind of break-in. The detail about the back door was particularly terrifying because it was accurate. I had been meaning to install a deadbolt but had not gotten around to it yet. I crept through the house, turning off all the lights and checking every window and door to make sure they were locked. My hands shook as I drew all the curtains and blinds, suddenly aware of how exposed I had been living. If someone had been watching us for 3 days, they had seen everything. When I fed Sophia, when I did laundry, when I took showers. The storm outside was getting worse, with thunder that seemed to shake the entire house. Each flash of lightning illuminated the yard for a split second, and I found myself scanning for signs of movement or unusual shadows. But the real terror was coming through that baby monitor, which continued to broadcast fragments of conversation throughout the evening. Around 9:30, I heard one of the voices say, "Lights are going out in the front rooms. She is getting ready for bed." I had indeed been turning off lights as I made my final rounds through the house, following my usual bedtime routine without realizing I was being observed. The fact that they could see into my house and coordinate their observations through some kind of radio communication was beyond frightening. I called my sister Maria, who lived about 15 minutes away, and asked her to come over. I could not explain everything over the phone without sounding completely insane, but I told her I was scared and needed someone to stay the night. She could hear the panic in my voice and agreed to drive over despite the storm. While waiting for Maria to arrive, I continued monitoring the radio transmissions. The voices discussed timing, entry methods, and what they were looking for once they got inside. They mentioned jewelry, electronics, and cash, making it clear that this was a planned burglary. But they also talked about making sure we did not wake up during the process, which implied they knew we would be home. "If she wakes up, we just tie her up until we are finished," one voice said casually. "The baby will not be a problem." That was the moment I realized these people were not just planning to rob my house. They were prepared to use violence if necessary. The casual way they discussed restraining me and dismissing Sophia as not a problem suggested they had done this before and knew how to handle complications. Maria arrived around 10:15, soaked from the rain and confused about why I had sounded so panicked on the phone. I showed her the baby monitor and played back some of the recordings I had captured on my phone. At first, she was skeptical, suggesting it might be interference from emergency services or utility workers dealing with storm damage. But as we listened together, more transmissions came through with specific details about our house and movements. The voices discussed which car was mine in the driveway, mentioned that a light was still on in the kitchen, and noted that a second person had arrived. "There is another car now," one voice observed. "Looks like she has company." "Should we wait?" the second voice asked. "No, stick to the plan. 2 women and a baby, we can handle it." Maria's face went white when she heard that. She immediately called 911 while I continued recording the transmissions. The police dispatcher took the call seriously, especially when Maria explained that we had audio recordings of people planning to break into the house that night. 2 patrol cars arrived within 10 minutes, and I played the recordings for the officers. They were initially puzzled by the baby monitor situation, but became very concerned when they heard the specific details about our house and the casual discussion of violence. The officers conducted a thorough search of the property and surrounding area. Behind the trees at the back of my yard, they found 2 men in a pickup truck with radio equipment and binoculars. The men had been using short-range radios to communicate while conducting surveillance, and somehow their frequency had been picked up by my baby monitor's receiver. Both men were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit burglary, stalking, and possession of burglary tools. Their truck contained rope, duct tape, crowbars, and detailed notes about my daily routine. They had been watching the house for over a week, not 3 days, as they had mentioned on the radio. During questioning, police learned that this was part of a larger operation targeting single mothers in the area. The men would identify houses with young children, conduct surveillance to learn routines, and then break in when they believed the occupants would be asleep. They specifically chose homes where they thought resistance would be minimal. The baby monitor had saved our lives by accidentally intercepting their radio communications. If I had not heard those transmissions, they would have broken in around midnight and found us completely unprepared. The police said it was extremely unusual for baby monitors to pick up 2-way radio signals, but the storm conditions and their proximity to the house had created perfect circumstances for the interference. After that night, I could not sleep peacefully for months. Every sound from the baby monitor made me jump, wondering if I was hearing normal household noises or something more sinister. I installed a complete security system with cameras, motion sensors, and professional monitoring. I moved Sophia's crib into my bedroom and kept it there for weeks. The most disturbing part was realizing how vulnerable we had been without knowing it. These men had been watching us, learning our habits, and planning violence while I went about my normal routine completely unaware. The baby monitor that was supposed to help me protect Sophia had accidentally revealed how much danger we were really in. I still use baby monitors, but I have learned to pay attention to unusual sounds or interference. Technology can be both a shield and a window, protecting us from some dangers while accidentally revealing others. That storm brought more than just wind and rain. It brought the terrifying knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The case went to trial 6 months later, and both men received significant prison sentences. But knowing they are locked up does not erase the memory of hearing strangers discuss breaking into my home and threatening my child. Some violations of safety and privacy leave permanent scars, changing how you view the world and your place in it forever. My name is Tyler Washington, and I work as a night security guard for a large office complex in Detroit, Michigan. Due to the pandemic, my company had transitioned to remote monitoring, which meant I could do most of my job from home using multiple computer screens and camera feeds. It was actually perfect for me. I could work nights while taking care of my elderly grandmother during the day, and the pay was decent enough to support both of us. Our house is a small 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood where most residents are elderly or working families. I had converted the basement into my home office, setting up multiple monitors to watch security feeds from various buildings downtown. The setup was impressive. 6 large screens showing different angles of lobbies, parking garages, and office floors that I monitored from midnight until 8 in the morning. My routine was consistent and methodical. I would start my shift at midnight, make coffee, and settle into my chair for 8 hours of surveillance. Every hour I would do a virtual patrol, checking each camera feed systematically and documenting anything unusual. Around 3 in the morning, I would take a 15-minute break to stretch my legs and grab a snack from the kitchen. At 6, I would make another cup of coffee to get through the final stretch. This routine had been working perfectly for almost a year when something started to feel wrong. It began 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night when I heard footsteps upstairs during my shift. At first, I assumed it was my grandmother getting up to use the bathroom, which happened occasionally despite her usually sleeping soundly through the night. But when I checked on her a few minutes later, she was fast asleep in her bed. The next night, I heard the same pattern of footsteps around the same time. Slow, deliberate walking from the kitchen to the living room, then back to the kitchen. Again, I found my grandmother sleeping peacefully when I investigated. I started to wonder if the house was settling or if I was hearing sounds from neighboring houses, but the footsteps were distinctly coming from directly above my basement office. By the end of that first week, the footsteps had become a nightly occurrence. They always happened around 2:30 in the morning, always followed the same path through the kitchen and living room, and always lasted about 5 minutes. But my grandmother was always asleep when I checked, and she never mentioned being up during the night. What made it truly disturbing was how closely the footsteps matched my own routine. I realized that the timing coincided exactly with when I would normally take my break and walk through the kitchen to get a snack. Someone upstairs was mimicking my movements, following the same path I took every night, but they were doing it while I was still in the basement. I started paying closer attention to other sounds in the house. The coffee maker would turn on at 3:15 every morning, which was when I typically made my second pot of coffee. But I had not turned it on. I would hear the familiar beep of the microwave around 4 o'clock, the exact time I usually heated up leftover dinner. Cabinet doors would open and close in the kitchen following the pattern of my usual snack preparation. The most unnerving part was hearing my own routine being performed upstairs while I sat in the basement doing my job. It was like listening to a recording of my normal night, except I was not the one making those sounds. Someone else was moving through my house, opening my cabinets, using my appliances, and following my schedule with disturbing precision. I began documenting everything, writing down the exact times I heard footsteps, appliance sounds, and cabinet doors. The pattern was incredibly consistent. Every sound happened at the precise time I would normally make that movement or use that appliance. Whoever was in my house had been watching me long enough to memorize my entire routine. The footsteps were always the same weight and pace as my own. The coffee maker ran for exactly the same duration I typically used. Even the microwave would beep for the same number of times I usually set it for. This level of detail suggested someone had been observing me for weeks or months, learning every aspect of my nightly habits. I installed a security camera in the kitchen, angled to capture the main walking area where I heard most of the sounds. The first night with the camera, I watched my monitors while simultaneously listening to the familiar footstep pattern above me. But when I checked the kitchen camera feed, the room was completely empty. No movement, no person, nothing to explain the sounds I was clearly hearing. This continued for several more nights, hearing detailed activity upstairs while seeing absolutely nothing on the camera. I started to question my sanity, wondering if the isolation and night shift work were causing some kind of auditory hallucinations. But the sounds were too specific, too consistent, and too closely matched to my routine to be imaginary. I decided to test the situation by changing my routine slightly. Instead of taking my break at 3 in the morning, I waited until 3:30. The footsteps upstairs adjusted to match my new timing. When I made coffee at 3:45 instead of 3:15, I heard the coffee maker turn on upstairs at exactly 3:45. Whoever was in my house was not following a memorized schedule. They were actively watching me and mimicking my movements in real time. This meant they had visual access to my basement office and could see when I stood up, when I walked toward the stairs, and when I performed specific actions. I spent an entire night searching for hidden cameras or other surveillance equipment in the basement, but found nothing. The house had been thoroughly renovated before we moved in, with new electrical work and updated systems, so it seemed unlikely that someone had installed monitoring devices during construction. The breakthrough came when I decided to remain completely still during my usual break time. I sat in my chair, did not make coffee, did not go upstairs, and did not follow any part of my normal routine. For the first time in weeks, the house remained silent. No footsteps, no appliances, no cabinet doors. Whoever was upstairs was clearly responding to my actions, not following a predetermined script. I realized that someone had been living in my house, hiding somewhere during the day when my grandmother and I were active, and emerging at night to shadow my movements. They had learned my routine so perfectly that they could anticipate my actions and move through the house while staying just out of sight. The next night, I pretended to start my normal routine but stopped halfway through. I walked toward the stairs as if going to the kitchen, then quietly returned to my monitors. Within seconds, I heard footsteps upstairs moving toward the kitchen. Someone was definitely following me, staying one room ahead to avoid detection. I called the police and explained the situation, though I knew it sounded bizarre. 2 officers came to investigate and conducted a thorough search of the house. They found evidence that someone had been living in the crawl space above the main floor ceiling, a small area accessible through the attic that provided a perfect hiding spot with visual access to most rooms through gaps in the old ceiling. The space contained blankets, food containers, and a small notebook filled with detailed observations about my grandmother's and my daily schedules. The notes included precise timing of when we slept, when we were out of the house, what we ate, and even personal conversations we had had in the kitchen. Someone had been watching and documenting our lives for months. They also found a small hole drilled in the basement ceiling that provided a clear view of my computer setup. This explained how the intruder could monitor my work routine and mimic my movements with such accuracy. They had been watching me work every night, learning my habits, and then performing a shadow version of my routine in the rooms above. The intruder was never caught, but evidence suggested they had been accessing the house through a loose attic vent that connected to the roof. They probably entered during the day when we were both occupied and hid in the crawl space until nighttime. The setup was sophisticated and suggested someone with construction knowledge who understood how to move through houses without detection. We installed proper security throughout the house, sealed all potential entry points, and added motion sensors in areas that had previously been unmonitored. My grandmother was shaken by the revelation that someone had been living above her bedroom for months, watching her sleep and documenting her routine. The most disturbing aspect was realizing that this person had no interest in stealing anything or causing immediate harm. They seemed content to observe, document, and mimic our lives while remaining hidden. The notebook contained months of detailed observations about our habits, preferences, and schedules, suggesting a level of obsession that went far beyond typical breaking and entering. I eventually had to change jobs because I could not focus on security monitoring while worrying about who might be watching me. Every sound in the house made me wonder if someone was hiding nearby, learning my new routine and preparing to begin their shadow performance again. The violation of having someone secretly live in your home Watching your most private moments changes your relationship with safety and privacy permanently. Even now, in a different house with better security, I still listen carefully during my breaks, wondering if those familiar footsteps might return to echo my movements from somewhere just out of sight. My name is Sofia Martinez, and I am an art student from the University of New Mexico. Last September, I rented a small cabin in the mountains outside Albuquerque for a month-long independent study project. The isolation was exactly what I needed to focus on my painting, but it also made me the perfect target for someone with very disturbing intentions. The cabin was about 30 minutes from the nearest town, nestled in a grove of pine trees with large windows that provided beautiful natural light for my artwork. It was a single-story structure with a wraparound porch, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a spacious living area that I had converted into my studio space. The owner was an elderly woman who lived in Santa Fe and rented the property to artists and writers seeking creative solitude. I had been there for about a week when I first noticed that something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of being watched that I initially attributed to the isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. But as the days passed, the sensation grew stronger, especially when I was working near the large windows that faced the forest. The cabin had windows on all sides, and I loved the feeling of being surrounded by nature while I painted. During the day, I kept most of the curtains open to maximize the natural light. But at night, those same windows became sources of anxiety. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, and I found myself checking and rechecking the locks before going to bed. About 10 days into my stay, I discovered the first piece of evidence that my unease was justified. While walking around the cabin one morning to stretch my legs, I noticed footprints in the soft soil beneath the living room windows. They were clearly fresh, made sometime during the night when the ground was still damp from an evening rain shower. The prints were from men's boots, size 10 or 11, and they formed a pattern that suggested someone had been standing at the window for an extended period. There were deeper impressions where the person had shifted their weight, indicating they had remained in that spot for quite some time. The positioning of the prints showed that whoever made them had been looking directly into my improvised studio where I spent most of my time. I called the property owner, Mrs. Gutierrez, to report the footprints, but she seemed unconcerned. She suggested it might have been a maintenance worker checking on the property, or perhaps a hiker who had gotten lost and was looking for help. Her casual dismissal made me question whether I was overreacting, but the footprints were definitely deliberate and purposeful, not the random marks of someone passing by. That night, I made sure all curtains were tightly closed before settling into work. But around 11 o'clock, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the direction of the kitchen window. It was rhythmic and gentle, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. When I crept toward the kitchen to investigate, the tapping stopped immediately. I stood in the darkened kitchen for several minutes, listening intently, but heard nothing more. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through a gap in the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of trees. But the timing was too perfect. The tapping had stopped the exact moment I approached the window, suggesting that whoever was outside could see my movements inside the cabin. The next day brought a discovery that made my blood run cold. While taking my morning walk around the property, I found a small digital camera partially hidden in the bushes near the bedroom window. It was camouflaged with green tape and positioned to capture a clear view of the room where I slept. The camera was still recording, its tiny red light blinking steadily. My hands shook as I examined the device. It was a trail camera, the type used by hunters to monitor wildlife, but it had been modified and carefully positioned to spy on the cabin. The angle and placement showed that whoever put it there had intimate knowledge of the cabin's layout. and my daily routines. They knew which room I slept in and had positioned the camera for maximum surveillance. I immediately called the sheriff's department, and Deputy Rodriguez arrived within an hour. He took the camera as evidence and conducted a thorough search of the property. We found 2 more cameras, one near the living room window where I did my painting, and another positioned to monitor the front entrance and my car. The cameras had been recording for at least a week, capturing footage of me arriving, unpacking, setting up my studio, and going about my daily routine. Deputy Rodriguez explained that this level of surveillance suggested someone was not just randomly spying, but was specifically targeting me and studying my habits for some unknown purpose. The most disturbing discovery came when we examined the memory cards from the cameras. They contained hours of footage showing me working, sleeping, cooking, and moving through the cabin completely unaware that I was being watched. But there were also videos taken from inside the cabin showing that someone had been entering the property while I was away. The interior footage showed a man in his 40s wearing dark clothing and gloves moving through my living space with disturbing familiarity. He went through my belongings, examined my paintings, and spent considerable time looking through my personal items. In one video, he was sitting on my bed holding one of my sweaters and bringing it to his face. Deputy Rodriguez identified the man as someone with a history of stalking and breaking into properties rented by young women. His name was David Kellerman, and he had been arrested twice before for similar behavior in Colorado and Arizona. He specifically targeted isolated rental properties where single women stayed alone, using surveillance equipment to study their routines before escalating to break-ins. The investigation revealed that Kellerman had been watching the cabin for weeks before I arrived, waiting for the right tenant. He had somehow gained access to the rental listings and specifically chose properties rented by young women who would be staying alone for extended periods. My artist residency made me a perfect target because he knew I would be isolated and focused on my work. Police found his campsite about half a mile from the cabin, hidden in a dense area of forest. He had been living there for over a month, equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment, camping gear, and detailed notes about my daily activities. His notebook contained my schedule, descriptions of my appearance, and disturbing personal observations about my habits and preferences. The campsite also contained photographs that he had taken of me through the cabin windows, printed on a portable printer. Some were taken during the day while I was painting, others at night when I was getting ready for bed. The photos were organized chronologically and included written comments about my appearance and activities that made it clear this was not random voyeurism, but an obsessive fixation. Kellerman was arrested 2 days later at a gas station in town where he was purchasing supplies. The police found additional surveillance equipment in his truck, along with cable ties, duct tape, and other items that suggested his intentions went far beyond simple observation. Deputy Rodriguez told me that based on the evidence, they believed he was planning to eventually approach or confront me directly. During questioning, Kellerman admitted to stalking multiple women in similar situations over the past 5 years. He would identify isolated rental properties, conduct surveillance for weeks, and then escalate to breaking in and spending time in their living spaces while they were away. In some cases, he had been living in or near rental properties simultaneously with his victims for weeks without their knowledge. The psychological evaluation revealed that Kellerman was obsessed with the idea of sharing living spaces with women without their consent. He derived satisfaction from being close to them, learning their habits, and infiltrating their private lives while remaining undetected. The cameras allowed him to feel connected to his victims even when he was not physically present. I had to cut my residency short and return to Albuquerque, but the experience left me with lasting trauma that affected my ability to work alone or stay in isolated locations. The knowledge that someone had been watching me sleep, Documenting my movements and entering my living space while I was gone created a violation of privacy that took months of therapy to address. The case went to trial 6 months later, and Kellerman was sentenced to 8 years in prison for stalking, breaking, and entering, and violation of all privacy. But knowing he is locked up does not erase the memory of seeing those photographs of myself taken without my knowledge, or the realization that someone had been sharing my living space and studying my life with such obsessive detail. Mrs. Gutierrez installed comprehensive security systems at the cabin and now screens tenants more carefully. But she told me that the experience made her reconsider renting to single women staying alone. The isolation that makes these properties attractive to artists and writers also makes them ideal hunting grounds for predators who know how to exploit vulnerability and privacy. I still paint, but I no longer work near large windows or stay in isolated locations alone. The art that was supposed to come from solitude and natural beauty instead came from the terrifying knowledge that privacy is often just an illusion, and that the most dangerous watchers are the ones you never know are there. My name is Jackson Miller, and I am 17 years old from Burlington, Vermont. What happened to me last fall during my uncle's business trip still makes me question how well we really know the people we trust. I was house sitting for my Uncle David, who lives in a quiet residential neighborhood about 15 minutes from where my parents and I live. He had asked me to stay at his place for 2 weeks while he traveled to Europe for work, taking care of his elderly cat and making sure the house looked occupied. Uncle David lived alone in a modest 2-story colonial house on Maple Street, surrounded by families who had been neighbors for years. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names, borrowed lawnmowers, and looked out for one another. Before leaving, my uncle introduced me to several neighbors and gave them my phone number in case any problems arose while he was away. The most helpful of these neighbors was Mr. Peterson, a man in his 50s who lived 3 houses down. He worked from home as some kind of consultant and seemed to know everyone in the neighborhood. Uncle David told me that Mr. Peterson was incredibly reliable and had helped with various house projects over the years. He had a key to the house for emergencies and had offered to check on me periodically while I was staying there alone. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. I attended school during the day and returned to Uncle David's house in the evening to do homework, feed the cat, and maintain my normal routine. Mr. Peterson stopped by twice during that first week, once to bring me some homemade cookies from his wife and another time to check that the heating system was working properly. I appreciated his attention and kindness, especially since I was still adjusting to sleeping in an unfamiliar house. Mr. Peterson seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being and made sure I had his phone number in case I needed anything. He mentioned several times that I should not hesitate to call him, even in the middle of the night, if anything seemed wrong or if I felt unsafe. By the end of the first week, Mr. Peterson's visits had become a daily occurrence. He would stop by every evening around 6 o'clock, always with some practical reason, checking the mail, inspecting the exterior lights, or bringing me food that his wife had prepared. While I was grateful for the attention, I started to notice that his visits were lasting longer and that he seemed particularly interested in my daily schedule. He would ask detailed questions about my school hours, what time I usually got home, whether I had plans for the weekend, and if any friends or family members were planning to visit. At first, I assumed he was just being thorough about neighborhood security, but gradually I realized that his questions were more specific than necessary for simple safety concerns. Mr. Peterson also began commenting on things that suggested he had been observing the house more closely than I had realized. He mentioned noticing that I kept late hours on weekends, that I had been watching television in the living room until nearly midnight, and that I had received several packages during the week. These observations required more surveillance than casual neighborly attention. The situation became genuinely unsettling when Mr. Peterson started letting himself into the house without knocking. He would use his emergency key and appear in the kitchen while I was doing homework or watching television, always with some excuse about checking on the furnace or investigating a strange noise he had heard. The first few times I accepted his explanations, but the frequency and timing of these unannounced visits made me increasingly uncomfortable. What disturbed me most was that Mr. Peterson always seemed to know exactly when I was home alone and when I would be arriving from school. He would appear within minutes of my return from school or emerge from somewhere in the house just as I was settling in for the evening. This level of timing suggested that he was monitoring my movements much more closely than appropriate. I started paying attention to Mr. Peterson's behavior and noticed details that should have alarmed me earlier. He knew which lights I typically turned on in the evenings, what I usually ate for dinner, what television programs I watched, and even what time I usually went to bed. This knowledge required observation that went far beyond casual neighborly interest. One evening, I decided to test my growing suspicion by varying my routine. Instead of coming straight home from school, I went to the library and stayed until nearly 8 o'clock. When I finally arrived at Uncle David's house, Mr. Peterson was waiting in his driveway and immediately approached me, asking why I was so late and whether everything was all right. His concern seemed excessive for someone who was simply watching out for me, and his knowledge of my usual schedule was too precise to be casual observation. I realized that Mr. Peterson had been tracking my daily movements with an attention to detail that crossed the line from helpful neighbor to something much more concerning. The breakthrough came when I found evidence that Mr. Peterson had been entering the house regularly when I was at school. I had started leaving small objects in specific positions before leaving in the morning. A book placed at a particular angle, a coffee cup positioned precisely on the counter, a magazine folded to a specific page. Each day, these items had been moved slightly, indicating that someone was spending time in the house while I was away. I also discovered that food was disappearing from the refrigerator in small amounts, and that the television was warm when I returned home, suggesting it had been used during the day. Someone was clearly making themselves comfortable in the house while I was at school, and Mr. Peterson was the only person with a key and detailed knowledge of my schedule. The most disturbing discovery came when I found a notebook hidden in the basement that contained detailed observations about my daily routine, personal habits, and even physical descriptions of my appearance and behavior. The handwriting was not Uncle David's, and the observations were far too detailed and personal to be innocent neighborhood watch activities. The notebook contained entries spanning several weeks, including dates before I had even arrived to house sit. This meant that whoever was writing these observations had been planning something involving me for quite some time. The entries included comments about my vulnerability, my isolation from family, and speculation about my personal relationships that made it clear this was not innocent surveillance. I called my parents immediately and explained the situation. They drove over that night and helped me search the house more thoroughly. We found additional evidence that someone had been using the house regularly, including personal items that did not belong to Uncle David and modifications to the basement that created a small living space behind the furnace. When we called the police, they took the situation very seriously. Detective Williams explained that using emergency access to enter someone's home for unauthorized surveillance was a serious crime, especially when it involved monitoring a minor. The notebook provided clear evidence of stalking behavior that had escalated to the point of illegal entry and invasion of privacy. The police arrested Mr. Peterson the next morning when they found him in Uncle David's house while I was at school. He had been using his emergency key to enter the property daily, sometimes spending several hours inside while I was away. He had created a comfortable setup in the basement where he could monitor my activities and document his observations about my routine and behavior. During questioning, Mr. Peterson admitted that he had been planning this surveillance for months, waiting for an opportunity when Uncle David would be away and I would be staying alone. He had volunteered to be the neighborhood contact specifically so he could gain access to the house and monitor me without suspicion. His helpful neighbor persona was entirely calculated to gain trust and access. The investigation revealed that Mr. Peterson had a history of similar behavior involving other young people in previous neighborhoods. He would identify vulnerable situations where teenagers were staying alone and position himself as a helpful adult figure while secretly conducting surveillance and documenting their personal lives. In 2 previous cases, his behavior had escalated to physical confrontation when his victims had become suspicious. Mr. Peterson was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and endangering the welfare of a minor. The case went to trial 8 months later and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But the psychological impact of learning that someone I trusted had been secretly living in the house and monitoring my every move took much longer to process. Uncle David was devastated to learn that someone he had trusted with his home and my safety had been using that trust to prey on me. He installed a complete security system and changed all the locks, but he also struggled with the guilt of having unknowingly facilitated the surveillance by providing access and legitimacy to someone with dangerous intentions. The experience taught me that predators often use positions of trust and authority to gain access to their victims. Mr. Peterson's Helpful Neighbor Act was perfectly designed to deflect suspicion while providing unlimited access to monitor and document my personal life. The most dangerous people are often those who appear most trustworthy and helpful, because their position makes it difficult to question their motives until the behavior becomes undeniably inappropriate. Even now, I am suspicious of adults who seem overly interested in my schedule or who position themselves as helpful figures without clear reasons for their attention. That false sense of security and trust can be more dangerous than obvious threats because it prevents victims from recognizing danger until the situation has already escalated beyond appropriate boundaries. My name is Avery Thompson, and I work remotely from my apartment in Boise, Idaho as a graphic designer. The flexibility of working from home has always been one of my favorite aspects of my job. But what happened to me last month made me realize how that routine can make you vulnerable to people with dangerous intentions. I live alone in a ground floor apartment in a quiet complex near the University District. The building has about 20 units and most residents are either graduate students or young professionals like myself. The complex has a secure entry system, but delivery drivers are typically buzzed in without much scrutiny, especially during the day when most people are expecting packages. My work involves frequent online orders, art supplies, computer equipment, and various materials for client projects. I probably receive packages 3 or 4 times a week, which has become such a normal part of my routine that I barely pay attention to delivery schedules anymore. Most drivers just leave packages outside my door with a quick knock or ring of the doorbell. 3 weeks ago, I noticed that my deliveries were becoming more frequent and coming at unusual times. I would find packages on my doorstep that I had not ordered, usually small items like office supplies or household goods. At first, I assumed there was some mix-up with addresses or that my upstairs neighbor was having items delivered to the wrong unit. The packages were always addressed to me, though, with my correct name and apartment number. When I checked my credit card statements and online accounts, I could not find any record of having ordered these items. I called a few of the shipping companies to report the error, but they insisted the items had been legitimately ordered from my address using valid payment information. After about a week of mysterious deliveries, I decided to stay home one day and watch for the delivery driver to see if I could figure out what was happening. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my doorbell rang and I immediately went to answer it. Standing outside was a man in a delivery uniform holding a small package. He was in his 30s, average height, with dark hair and an overly friendly demeanor that seemed forced. When I opened the door, he smiled broadly and said he had been making deliveries to my apartment for several weeks and wanted to make sure I was satisfied with the service. He asked detailed questions about my work schedule, whether I was usually home during the day and if I lived alone. The questions felt intrusive, but I assumed he was just being thorough about delivery logistics. I mentioned that I worked from home most days and that packages could be left outside my door if I was not available to answer. He seemed pleased by this information and lingered outside my apartment for several more minutes, making small talk about the neighborhood and complimenting my apartment's location. After he left, I realized that legitimate delivery drivers rarely have extended conversations with recipients or ask personal questions about living situations. His interest in my schedule and living arrangements seemed excessive for someone just delivering packages. I also noticed that he had been looking past me into my apartment while we talked, scanning the interior as if assessing the layout. Over the next few days, the mysterious packages continued arriving. But now I paid closer attention to the delivery process. I noticed that the same driver was making all the deliveries, even though the packages came from different companies that should have been using different shipping services. This suggested that someone was specifically arranging for the same person to have repeated access to my building and apartment. I started keeping track of delivery times and noticed they were becoming more frequent and occurring at specific times when I had previously mentioned being home. If I had told him I usually took lunch breaks around noon, packages would arrive right around 12 o'clock. If I had mentioned working late on certain projects, deliveries would come in the evening hours. The breakthrough came when I decided to install a small security camera near my door to monitor delivery activity. The first day with the camera, I captured footage that made my blood run cold. The delivery driver was not just dropping off packages and leaving. He was using some kind of tool to manipulate my door lock and spending several minutes inside my apartment while I was out. The video showed him entering my apartment, walking through the rooms and examining my personal belongings with disturbing familiarity. He went through my desk drawers, looked at photographs, and spent considerable time in my bedroom, opening closets and examining clothing. He was clearly using the delivery visits as opportunities to case my apartment and learn about my personal life. I immediately called the police and showed them the security footage. Detective Morrison took the case very seriously and explained that using delivery services to gain access to homes was an increasingly common tactic used by burglars and stalkers. The fake packages provided legitimate cover for repeated visits and allowed the perpetrator to study potential victims and their routines. The investigation revealed that the man was not actually employed by any of the shipping companies whose uniforms he wore. His name was Robert Chen, and he had been purchasing delivery uniforms online and creating fake packages to gain access to apartment complexes throughout the city. He specifically targeted young women who lived alone and worked from home. Police found his apartment filled with stolen items from dozens of homes, photographs of women taken without their knowledge, and detailed notes about the daily routines of potential victims. He had been conducting this scheme for over a year, using fake deliveries to identify vulnerable targets, and then escalating to burglary or worse. Chen's notes about me were particularly disturbing. He had documented my work schedule, social activities, and even personal habits like what I typically wore around the apartment. He knew when I usually showered, when I ordered food, and when I was most likely to be distracted by work projects. He had been planning something much more serious than simple burglary. The investigation revealed that Chen had a history of sexual assault charges in another state and had been using the delivery scheme to identify and monitor potential victims. Several other women came forward after his arrest, reporting similar experiences with mysterious packages and overly friendly delivery drivers who asked too many personal questions. Chen had been using the fake deliveries to gradually desensitize victims to his presence and gather information about their vulnerabilities. The packages created a sense of routine and familiarity that made his frequent visits seem normal and legitimate. By the time victims became suspicious, he already had detailed knowledge of their homes and schedules. The most disturbing aspect was learning that Chen had been planning to escalate his behavior. Police found detailed plans for home invasions, including information about which victims would be easiest to overpower and which apartments provided the best opportunities for assault without detection. My security camera had likely prevented a much more serious crime. Chen was arrested and charged with burglary, stalking, identity theft, and possession of stolen property. During the investigation, police linked him to over 30 similar cases across 3 states. He had been using the fake delivery scheme to commit crimes for several years, always moving to new areas when local police began investigating suspicious delivery patterns. The case went to trial 6 months later, and Chen was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But the psychological impact of learning that someone had been systematically infiltrating my personal space and planning to assault me was devastating. I had to move to a different apartment and completely change my work routine and online ordering habits. I now verify all deliveries before accepting packages, require identification from all delivery personnel, and never provide personal information about my schedule or living situation to strangers. I also installed comprehensive security equipment and changed my delivery address to a secure pickup location rather than having items sent directly to my home. The experience taught me that predators are constantly evolving their tactics to exploit new vulnerabilities created by modern conveniences. The rise of online shopping and frequent deliveries has created opportunities for criminals to gain legitimate access to private spaces while appearing to provide normal services. What made Chen's scheme so effective was that delivery drivers are expected to be in residential areas, asking about schedules and having access to buildings and apartments. His fake packages provided perfect cover for surveillance and infiltration activities that would otherwise be obviously suspicious. Even now, I feel anxious whenever my doorbell rings unexpectedly or when delivery drivers ask questions beyond basic logistics. The violation of having someone systematically infiltrate my personal space while pretending to provide a service has permanently changed how I interact with strangers and how much personal information I share in casual conversations. The case highlighted how criminals are adapting to exploit the trust and convenience that modern life depends on, turning everyday interactions into opportunities for predatory behavior that can escalate to serious violence. My name is Dakota Kim, and I am a 20-year-old college student at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. What happened to me last spring during my recovery from ACL surgery still haunts me and has completely changed how I view healthcare workers and the trust we place in people who enter our homes during vulnerable times. I had torn my ACL playing intramural soccer in February, requiring reconstructive surgery that left me bedridden for several weeks with limited mobility. My parents lived in California, so they arranged for a home health aide through a reputable medical agency to help me with daily tasks while I recovered in my off-campus apartment near the university. The apartment was a small one-bedroom place that I normally shared with my roommate Jessica, but she had moved out temporarily to do an internship in Atlanta. This meant I would be alone with whatever healthcare worker the agency assigned to me, which made my parents nervous but seemed necessary given my limited mobility and the pain medication that left me drowsy and disoriented. The agency sent someone named Marcus Williams, a man in his early 30s who had excellent credentials and references from previous clients. He was professional during our initial meeting, explaining his experience with post-surgical care and outlining a schedule for helping me with meals, medication management, and physical therapy exercises. He seemed competent and caring, which put both my parents and me at ease. For the first week, Marcus followed his schedule perfectly. He would arrive at 8 in the morning, help me shower and get dressed, prepare meals, assist with my physical therapy routine, and handle household tasks that I could not manage on crutches. He was professional, respectful of my privacy, and genuinely seemed invested in helping me recover quickly. The arrangement was supposed to last for 3 weeks until I could manage independently, but by the second week, Marcus began suggesting changes to the schedule that made me uncomfortable. He proposed staying overnight so he could monitor my pain levels and help if I needed assistance during the night. When I declined, he insisted that his other clients always appreciated having 24-hour care. Marcus also began asking increasingly personal questions about my social life, relationships, and family finances. He wanted to know if I had a boyfriend who might visit, whether my parents planned to check on me, and how much money I had access to for medical expenses. These questions seemed excessive for someone providing basic healthcare assistance. By the third week, Marcus had established a pattern of arriving earlier than scheduled and staying later than necessary. He would let himself in using the key I had given him and often be in my apartment when I woke up, claiming he wanted to check on me during the night. When I expressed discomfort with this arrangement, he assured me it was standard procedure for patients on strong pain medication. The situation became genuinely alarming when I discovered that Marcus had been going through my personal belongings while I slept. I found my laptop moved to different locations, dresser drawers slightly open, and personal documents that had been disturbed. When I confronted him about this, he claimed he was looking for my medication schedule and insurance information to better coordinate my care. Marcus also began making comments about my appearance and recovery that crossed professional boundaries. He would compliment my body during physical therapy sessions, make suggestive remarks about helping me bathe, and ask detailed questions about my intimate relationships that had no relevance to my medical care. When I tried to redirect these conversations, he would claim he was just being friendly and trying to keep my spirits up. The breaking point came when I woke up one night to find Marcus sitting in my bedroom chair watching me sleep. He claimed he was checking on my breathing and pain levels, but when I asked him to leave, he became defensive and insisted that monitoring patients during sleep was part of his job responsibilities. His presence in my bedroom at 3 in the morning felt predatory and inappropriate. I called the home health agency the next morning to request a different aide, but Marcus intercepted the call, taking the phone from me and speaking to his supervisor privately. He told me afterward that the agency was satisfied with his care and that changing aides mid-treatment would disrupt my recovery progress. He also mentioned that filing complaints could affect my insurance coverage and delay my return to school. That afternoon, while Marcus was supposedly running errands, I called the agency directly from my cell phone. The supervisor I spoke with had no record of Marcus calling them and seemed surprised by my description of his behavior. When I detailed his overnight stays, personal questions, and invasive monitoring, she immediately expressed concern and said this was not standard protocol for their aides. The supervisor explained that Marcus was only authorized to provide daytime care and should never have been staying overnight or accessing my apartment outside of scheduled hours. She also confirmed that going through patients' personal belongings and making inappropriate comments were serious violations of their professional standards. She promised to investigate immediately and send a replacement aide within 24 hours. When Marcus returned that evening, I told him that the agency was sending someone else to complete my care. His reaction was immediate and frightening. He became angry, defensive, and insisted that I was overreacting to normal healthcare procedures. He claimed that all his previous clients had been grateful for his dedicated attention and that I was being ungrateful for the extra care he provided. Marcus refused to leave my apartment that night, claiming he needed to properly transition my care to the new aide and that abandoning a patient mid-treatment would be irresponsible. When I insisted he leave, he became increasingly agitated and began making veiled threats about my safety and recovery. He implied that without his protection, I was vulnerable to break-ins or accidents. I managed to call 911 while Marcus was in the bathroom, and 2 police officers arrived within 15 minutes. When they asked Marcus to explain his presence in my apartment after being dismissed, he claimed there had been a misunderstanding and that he was still officially assigned to my case. However, when the officers called the agency, they confirmed that Marcus had been immediately suspended pending investigation. The police escorted Marcus from my apartment, but he returned 2 hours later using the key I had forgotten to retrieve from him. I was awakened by sounds in the kitchen and found him preparing food, claiming he was concerned about my nutrition and wanted to make sure I ate properly. The officers had to return and arrest him for criminal trespass in violation of a no-contact order. The investigation revealed that Marcus had a history of inappropriate behavior with female clients that the agency had either overlooked or inadequately investigated. 3 previous clients had filed complaints about boundary violations, unauthorized overnight stays, and invasive questioning, but Marcus had managed to explain away each incident as misunderstandings or necessary medical care. More disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had been photographing me while I slept and documenting personal details about my living situation, finances, and social connections. Police found his phone contained dozens of photos taken in my apartment without my knowledge, along with detailed notes about my daily routine, medication schedule, and periods of vulnerability. Marcus was charged with stalking, criminal trespass, invasion of privacy, and violation of professional standards. The Home Health Agency faced additional scrutiny for inadequate background checks and failure to properly investigate previous complaints. During the legal proceedings, 2 other women came forward with similar experiences involving Marcus's inappropriate behavior during their recovery periods. The psychological impact of having someone exploit my medical vulnerability was devastating. I had trusted Marcus with access to my home, my physical care, and my personal safety during one of the most helpless periods of my life. Learning that he had been documenting my vulnerability and photographing me without consent felt like a profound violation of the most basic human dignities. The case highlighted how medical professionals can exploit the trust and dependency that comes with home health care services. Patients recovering from surgery or managing chronic conditions are often isolated, medicated, and physically vulnerable, making them ideal targets for predators who use legitimate medical access to commit crimes. I had to complete my recovery with a different aid and additional security measures, but the experience left me with lasting anxiety about medical care and trusting healthcare workers in private settings. The violation of having someone exploit my physical helplessness and medical needs for predatory purposes created trust issues that affected my relationships with all healthcare providers. Marcus was sentenced to 18 months in prison and banned from working in healthcare, but the agency's failure to properly screen and monitor their employees raised broader questions about patient safety in home care situations. The case became part of a larger investigation into inadequate oversight of home health care workers and the vulnerability of patients who require in-home medical assistance. Even now, 2 years later, I remain hypervigilant about healthcare workers and never allow anyone to provide medical care in my home without additional oversight. The experience taught me that medical credentials and professional references cannot guarantee that someone will not exploit the trust and vulnerability that comes with providing intimate healthcare services. The most disturbing aspect was realizing that my physical recovery had been secondary to Marcus's personal agenda. He had used my medical needs as cover for stalking, surveillance, and exploitation, turning what should have been a healing process into a prolonged period of victimization that extended my vulnerability far beyond my original injury. My name is River Bennett, and I live in Salem, Oregon, in a small house about 10 minutes from downtown. What happened to me during a winter storm last January taught me that natural disasters create opportunities for predators who know how to exploit chaos and confusion to target vulnerable people. I am 23 years old and work as a freelance web developer, which means I spend most of my time at home working on my computer. I live alone in a modest single-story house in a quiet residential neighborhood where most of my neighbors are elderly or families with young children. It is the kind of place where people know each other by name and look out for one another, especially during emergencies. On January 15th, a massive ice storm hit the Pacific Northwest, bringing with it winds that knocked down power lines and tree branches throughout the region. By 8 o'clock that evening, my entire neighborhood had lost electricity, and the temperature inside my house was dropping rapidly as the heating system shut down. I had prepared for the storm by stocking up on flashlights, batteries, candles, and non-perishable food, but I had not anticipated how isolating and vulnerable the complete loss of power would make me feel. My cell phone had limited battery life, and with no internet or landline service, I was effectively cut off from the outside world. Around 10 o'clock, I heard someone knocking on my front door. When I looked through the peephole with my flashlight, I saw a man in what appeared to be an official utility company uniform holding a clipboard and wearing a hard hat. He identified himself as a power company technician conducting door-to-door checks to assess damage and estimate repair times. The man seemed legitimate. He knew specific details about the storm, mentioned that several transformers in the area had been damaged, and explained that crews were working around the clock to restore power. He asked if I was experiencing any electrical hazards like downed lines near my house or unusual smells that might indicate gas leaks. His questions seemed reasonable, and I was grateful that the utility company was being so thorough about checking on residents during the emergency. When he asked if I lived alone and whether I had adequate heating sources to get through the night, I told him I was managing well with blankets and a small camping stove for heating food. The technician, who said his name was Frank, explained that the power outage was expected to last at least 2 more days due to the extent of the damage. He offered to check my electrical panel to make sure there were no safety issues that could cause problems when power was restored, and suggested I might want to stay with family or friends if I did not have adequate heating. I appreciated his concern and allowed him to examine the electrical panel in my basement. He spent about 10 minutes looking at the breaker box with his flashlight, making notes on his clipboard and explaining that everything looked safe. Before leaving, he gave me his business card and said crews would return the next day to continue assessments. After Frank left, I felt reassured that professionals were handling the emergency situation. But about an hour later, I heard someone trying to open my back door. When I investigated with my flashlight, I could see the door handle being turned from the outside, and someone was definitely attempting to enter my house. I grabbed a kitchen knife and called out that I was armed and had already called the police. The attempted entry stopped immediately, but I could hear footsteps moving around the outside of my house. Someone was circling the property, testing windows and trying other potential entry points. My cell phone had very little battery remaining, but I managed to call 911 and report the attempted break-in. The dispatcher said multiple officers were responding to emergency calls throughout the city due to the storm, but someone would be sent to check on me as soon as possible. She advised me to remain inside and avoid confronting the intruder directly. While waiting for police, I heard the person continue to move around my house, testing windows and doors systematically. It became clear that whoever was outside was not randomly trying to break in, but was methodically checking every possible entry point as if they were familiar with standard residential security vulnerabilities. About 30 minutes later, I heard someone at my front door again, claiming to be Frank, returning to check on additional safety concerns. But this time his voice sounded different, and when I looked through the peephole, I could not see anyone in the darkness. The person was standing outside the range of my flashlight, which suggested they were deliberately trying to avoid being identified. I refused to open the door and told the person that police were on their way. Immediately, I heard rapid footsteps running away from the house, confirming that this was not a legitimate utility worker, but someone who was using the storm as cover for criminal activity. The police arrived about an hour later and conducted a thorough search of my property. They found evidence that someone had been attempting to pry open windows and had damaged the lock on my back door. Officer Martinez explained that power outages create ideal conditions for burglars who know that security systems are disabled and that residents are isolated and vulnerable. The business card that Frank had given me was fake. The utility company confirmed they were not conducting door-to-door checks and that all their crews were focused on repairing infrastructure, not individual assessments. The uniform and equipment he carried were easily purchased online and provided perfect cover for gaining access to homes during the emergency. Officer Martinez explained that criminals often monitor emergency services during natural disasters, listening to police scanners to identify areas where response times are delayed. They use official-looking uniforms and equipment to gain trust and access, then return later when they know residents are isolated and unable to call for help quickly. The investigation revealed that several homes in the area had been targeted during the storm using similar tactics. The perpetrator would pose as an emergency worker, utility technician, or relief volunteer to gain entry and assess homes for valuables and security weaknesses. He would then return later to commit burglaries when he knew residents were alone and cut off from communication. Police found the man 2 days later when power was restored and security cameras came back online. His name was Michael Torres, and he had an extensive criminal history of using natural disasters and emergencies to commit burglaries and home invasions. He specifically targeted areas where power outages disabled security systems and isolated residents from help. Torres had been monitoring emergency broadcasts and police communications to identify neighborhoods where power outages were expected to last multiple days. He would then pose as various types of emergency personnel to gain access to homes and gather information about residents, security systems, and valuable items that could be stolen later. The fake uniforms and equipment found in his possession were sophisticated and would have fooled most people during an emergency situation. He had uniforms for utility workers, emergency management personnel, and relief volunteers, along with clipboards, identification badges, and other props that made his impersonation convincing. During questioning, Torres admitted to targeting my house specifically because I had told him I lived alone and had valuable electronics for my work. He had planned to return after midnight when he knew I would be isolated and unable to call for help quickly due to limited cell phone battery and poor emergency response times during the storm. Torres was charged with attempted burglary, impersonating a public official, and criminal trespass. The investigation linked him to over 20 similar incidents across 3 states during various natural disasters over the past 2 years. He specifically targeted rural and suburban areas where residents were likely to trust official-looking personnel and where emergency response was delayed. The case highlighted how natural disasters create unique vulnerabilities that criminals actively exploit. The combination of disabled security systems, limited communication, delayed emergency response, and residents' increased willingness to trust people claiming to provide help creates ideal conditions for predatory behavior. I had to install battery backup systems for my security equipment and develop protocols for verifying the identity of anyone claiming to be emergency personnel. The experience taught me that criminals are often more organized and prepared for disasters than residents are, and they specifically plan to exploit the chaos and vulnerability that emergencies create. The psychological impact of having someone exploit my trust during a genuine emergency situation was particularly disturbing. Torres had used my natural desire to cooperate with authorities and accept help during a crisis to gather information that would have made me a victim of serious crimes later that night. Even now, I am suspicious of anyone who claims to be providing emergency services during disasters, and I always verify credentials through official channels before allowing anyone access to my home. The experience taught me that predators are often the best prepared people during emergencies because they have specifically planned to exploit the vulnerabilities that disasters create in normal security and communication systems. The storm that was supposed to bring my community together instead revealed how isolated and vulnerable we become when our normal safety networks fail, and how quickly criminals can exploit that vulnerability to target people who are just trying to survive difficult circumstances.